the Medici.
Chapter 9. Lorenzo the Magnificent.
Please like this video so that more people have access to this content. Enjoy and also follow this channel to see other videos about art.
Lorenzo the Magnificent, born 1449, ruled 1469 to 1492, died 1492. 1. The first 9 years of his rule, 1469 to 1478. Lorenzo, the elder son of Piero il Gotozzo, was only 20 years old when, by his father's death, he became the head of the family and succeeded to the rule of Florence. 6 months earlier, he had been married, as already noted, to Clarice Orsini. His 3 sisters, Maria, Lucrezia, or Nanina, and Bianca, married respectively to Leopetto Rossi, Bernardo Rucellai, and Guglielmo de Pazzi. Were all older than himself, while his brother, Giuliano, was 4 years his junior. His mother, Lucrezia, lived during the first 13 years of his rule over Florence. Having been for several years accustomed to take a large part in public affairs, he was better prepared than most young men of his age would have been for the position to which he was called so much earlier than either his father or his grandfather had been, each of whom who had been over 40 when he became head of the family. In Lorenzo the Magnificent, the abilities of this family reached their climax. Probably no other man has ever had great talents in so many directions, in statesmanlike insight and judgment, in political wisdom and promptness of decision, in power of influencing men, in profound knowledge of the ancient classical authors, as a poet and writer who bore a principal part in the development of the Italian language, in artistic taste and critical knowledge of the various branches of art, in knowledge of agriculture, the life and needs of the people, and country pursuits. In all these different directions was Lorenzo eminent. The title of Magnificent, which has by common consent been accorded to him, was not due to any ostentation in his private life, for there he was notably unostentatious. He was so called because of his extraordinary abilities, his great liberality, his lavish expenditure of his wealth for the public benefit, and the general magnificence of his life in which Florence participated, so that his name is intended to bring to our minds not personal ostentation, but the splendor with which he invested Florence. Yet while Lorenzo raised Florence to be the most important state in Italy, set her on a pinnacle as the acknowledged intellectual and artistic capital of Europe, and increased the prosperity of her citizens to the highest point, he has, from later ages, received unmeasured condemnation for a far-reaching change which he brought about in her government, and for the creation in this jealously guarded republic of what was practically an autocracy. It is true that his grandfather, Cosimo, had yielded an influence in the state, such as enabled him to sway public affairs according to his will. But the position created by Lorenzo went beyond this, and was different in kind. In his case, it was not an influence, but a rule. Lorenzo, as a matter of fact, had a greater power of statesmanlike vision than even his grandfather Cosimo. He saw that the Florentines were too liable to give way to private feuds to be really fitted for republican institutions, while under an autocratic rule there was practically no limit to the political importance and domestic prosperity which Florence might be conducted. That he should cherish the desire that his own family should be the one to exercise that rule was not only natural but justified. The Medici alone among the families of Florence had shown themselves to possess the qualities which could successfully govern the Florentines. Their power had been gained by those means which alone give a just title to rule, while added to all other qualifications they possessed as a family a positive genius for pouring oil on troubled waters and getting men to work harmoniously together, who under any other rule were ever at enmity. This valuable characteristic, which has passed unnoticed, Cosimo, Piero, and Lorenzo himself all possessed in a marked degree. While it is one which comes out again and again in this family long after their time, Lorenzo, in carrying out this change, took a unique course. Convinced that an autocratic style of government was the only one of which the conditions of the time admitted, he yet did not follow the example of other rulers around him, who in that age were erecting thrones, their methods being force, crime, and treachery. Instead, he solved the apparently impossible problem of combining two things diametrically opposed, an autocracy and a democracy, and contrived to preserve the form of government loved by his countrymen, and yet to wield personally an autocratic power. Unsupported by any military force, he yet exercised absolute authority, but only because his countrymen well knew that no one else could produce such happy results. The Florentines saw their city, through his abilities, raised to the leading place among Italian states, made the intellectual and artistic capital of Europe, and daily advancing in a commercial prosperity in which they each individually shared, and they had no desire to kill the goose which laid such golden eggs. They felt that however autocratic was Lorenzo's rule, they had power to end it whenever determined to do so. And the correctness of the view was fully proved by subsequent events. While, however, Lorenzo wielded an autocratic power, it is necessary to bear in mind, especially in financial matters, that the governing body of the state remained, as heretofore, the signoria. The word rule or reign, as applied to the Medici, although it is impossible to use any other, is calculated to lead to the supposition that they received the money raised by taxation, and hence to the idea, when we hear of large expenditure by them for the public benefit or amusement, or for the advancement of learning, that the money so spent was public money, and that possibly the people were heavily taxed to provide it, all of which would be the very opposite of the truth. The money raised by taxation was received by the signoria, and spent by that body in other directions. And that which the Medici spent on works for public benefit or on pageants and festivities for the amusement of the people was given from their own private fortune derived from their great banking business. The historian of this time, Machiavelli, speaks of Lorenzo thus: he governed the republic with great judgment, and was recognized as an equal by various crowned heads of other countries. Though notice ably without military ability, he yet conducted several wars to a successful conclusion by his diplomacy. He was the greatest patron of literature and art that any prince has ever been, and he won the people by his liberality and other popular qualities. By his political talents, he made Florence the leading state in Italy, and by his other qualities, he made her the intellectual, artistic, and fashionable center of Italy. And in connection with these achievements, Lorenzo shows one notable characteristic. Though he had in him the capacity to do all this, and was in ability a head and shoulders above all men around him, yet never throughout his life did he show any arrogance, that quality in Uberti, the Albizzi, the Pazzi, and other chief families of Florence, which the people had always so detested. And to the day of his death, though so admired by Florence as the source of all her greatness, remained always singularly free from this failing. Autocratic sovereign of Tuscany, practically arbiter of the politics of all Italy, treated by the sovereigns of France and England as an equal, there is not a sign in him of that arrogant self-assertion which, in one belonging to a bourgeois family, would, with so many, have been an inevitable accompaniment of such greatness. Lorenzo did not maintain even the amount of state considered necessary by the president of a modern republic. No officials guarded the entrance to the Medici palace. To every citizen of Florence, Lorenzo behaved and spoke on all occasions, public or private, as to an equal, while every historian mentions his marked courtesy of manner, even to the poorest of the people. Such was the young head of the Medici family, who at so early an age succeeded to the thorny position of ruler over turbulent Florence, without a military force to support that rule or anything else to rely upon but his own abilities. In his memoirs, Lorenzo himself describes the manner of his accession in terms that are almost comical in their diplomatic depreciation of the position to which he was called and his own ability to fill it. He says, "The second day after my father's death, although I, Lorenzo, was very young, that is to say, only in my 21st year, the principal men of the city and of the state came to our house to condole us on our loss, and to encourage me to take on myself the care of the city and of the state, as my father and grandfather had done. This proposal being against the instincts of my youthful age, and considering the burden and danger were great, I consented to it unwillingly. but I did so in order to protect our friends and property. For it fares ill in Florence with anyone who possesses wealth without any control in the government. The contrast in Lorenzo's case between the difficult conduct of public affairs and the chief outward occupations of his life, particularly during the earlier part of his rule, is very striking. It was a period when the exuberant vitality of the Renaissance was at its height. And the first 9 years of his rule, when he was from 20 to 29 and his brother Giuliano from 16 to 25, was a time in Florence of constant festivities, of music, art, and poetry, of joy and laughter, and all the bright side of life. It was the fashion of the day to import into all the amusements an imitation of the classic times of ancient Greece, and the Florence of that time appears set before us as a city with youth at the prow and pleasure at the helm, and full of all the life, joy, and pleasure of the old pagan ideal of Greece, set in a 15th century dress. Besides all his duties in regard to state affairs, and labors in the founding of institutions to advance learning, not to mention his own literary work, Lorenzo with his brother led these festivities, organizing pageants and other spectacles of the most costly description, permeated with classical learning and poetical allusions for the popular amusement. Nor are Lorenzo and Giuliano to be considered as the sole authors of such a change from the old, plain living and high thinking ideal of Florence. The age was one in which this sort of thing was in the air throughout Italy, and not in Florence alone. It was the way in which that portion of human need, which in our age is provided for by theaters and music halls, was then supplied. Lorenzo has been charged with thus leading Florentines into profligacy. But had that been the case, there could scarcely have failed to have been evidence of some protest made by his high-minded mother, Lucrezia Tornabuoni, whose influence over him was, as we know, very great. The entertainments organized by these two brilliant young Medici took the form sometimes of grand processions and tournaments, but more often of the most elaborate allegorical masks. Lorenzo and Giuliano themselves designed the various tableaux, into which every kind of classical allusion was woven, while their execution was entrusted to the greatest artists of the day, no trouble or expense being spared to make these gorgeous spectacles, in which the times of ancient Greece were revived before the eyes of the Florentines, as perfect and dramatic as possible. The costumes and chariots were designed by the most celebrated painters. The groups were arranged by renowned sculptors. The speeches were prepared by the foremost classical scholars, such as Marsilio, Ficino, Luigi Pulci, and Politian. Horses dressed up in the skins of lions and tigers, beautiful women posed as the goddesses of pagan divinity, and poets wrote elaborate compositions in verse describing the meaning of the different tableaux in the processions. Nor were the young people of the time very unlike those of our day in devising pastimes of a yet lighter kind, not to mention midnight tournaments in which fireworks took the place of more deadly weapons, and magnificently arrayed processions by the young men to serenade the young ladies they desired to honor. We have, in a letter to Lorenzo the year before, a midnight snowballing match related. The heroine of this particular adventure was Marietta Palestrozzi, the daughter of Lorenzo Palestrozzi. The young heiress who, both her parents being dead, was thought unduly emancipated because she lived where she liked and did what she would. And those features are immortalized by Desiderio's beautiful bust of her, half princess, halfway ward child, with saucy chin and wilful hair. Writing in Latin to Lorenzo, then absent at Pisa, his friend Filippo Corsini, detailing the latest doings of Florentine society, says, "And whilst I am writing to thee, almost the whole city is covered with snow, tiresome for many, and obliging them to stay within, but for others a cause of much merriment and pleasure. Thou must know that there were together Lattieri Neroni, Priore Pandolfini, and Bartolo Meo Benci, Mariette's betrothed. And they did say, Let us seize upon the occasion to make some fine diversion. And immediately, at about 2 o'clock of the night, they did present themselves before the house of Marietta Strozzi, followed by a great multitude assembled from every part to make sport with her at throwing snow. And they gave her a portion, and then they began. Ye immortal gods, what a spectacle! How can I describe it unto thee, my Lorenzo, in this feeble prose? The innumerable torches, the blowing of trumpets, the piping of flutes, the excited and cheering crowd. And what a triumph when one of the besiegers did succeed in flinging snow upon the maiden's face, as white as the snow itself. But what do I say, flinging snow? It was truly a veritable shooting at a mark, and by most expert marksmen. Moreover, Marietta herself, so graceful and so skilled in this game, and beautiful as all do know, did acquit herself with very great honor. But the noble youths would not take leave of her until they had bestowed most generous gifts upon her for a remembrance of them. And thus, to the great contentment of all, this pleasant sport came to an end. Marietta did not marry the hero of this snowballing match. She married in 1471 to one of the Calcagnini family of Ferrara, and left Florence for the city of which Leonora Arago became 2 years later the Duchess. Well might Lorenzo write in his poems, Quante bella giovinezza, che si fugge tuttavia, che vu ol esser lieto sia, di domen noce certezza. Or in English, how beautiful is youth, which yet flies quickly away. Who has a mind to be joyous, let him be so, for of tomorrow there is no certainty. But Lorenzo was not always planning pageants and festivities, or engaged in state affairs. Many other things also occupied his attention. Around his villa on Fiesole, he gave small villas to the most celebrated literary men of the time, thus gathering round him a society of literati, of whom we are all told that their readings, recitations, and discussions revived a knowledge and love of classical learning for which posterity has the utmost reason to be grateful. In his villa at Fiesole, and in his beloved villa of Careggi, Lorenzo read with them the ancient authors, wrote Latin verses and poetry in the language of Tuscany, and took an active part in musical entertainments. A feast was held at his villa of Careggi every 7th November to commemorate the birth of Plato, and remarkable indeed must have been one of these gatherings of all the most brilliant scholars of the time. Lorenzo found time also for field sports, of which both he and Giuliano were passionately fond, rising, he says, at the earliest dawn, when the east is already red and the tops of the mountains appear to be of gold. And the remarkable thing is that notwithstanding pageants, classical studies, literary work, social gatherings, and field sports, there was no neglect of public affairs, but that, on the contrary, these were most ably administered. In 1470, soon after his father Piero's death, there came, as on each occasion that the family gained a new head, another attempt to destroy the Medici. Dieti Salvi Neroni, and the others exiled with them, thought they saw an opportunity for doing this now that Piero was gone, and in view of Lorenzo's youth and inexperience. Accordingly, having collected a force, they seized Prato, the nearest of Florence's subject towns, and hoped by means of concurrent intrigues in Florence and assistance from Ferrara to succeed in the above object. But Lorenzo was equal to the occasion. The intrigues in the city were foiled by his tact, troops were sent from Florence who retook Prato, and the rebellion was put down. In 1741, the Duke of Milan, Galeazzo Sforza, came with his wife, Bona of Savoy, and 2 daughters, and a great retinue to visit Lorenzo, the latter having himself twice been entertained at Milan, once in 1465, when at the age of 16 he was present at the marriage of Ippolito Sforza to the Duke of Calabria, and again in 1469, when he went to represent his father as godfather to Galeazzo Sforza's infant heir. On the occasion of this visit to Florence, the Duke of Milan, desiring to overawe and impress his 2 young hosts, as well as the people of Florence, came with a great display of his wealth and importance. We are told that his retinue included counselors, chamberlains, courtiers, and vassals, 12 litters covered with gold brocade in which the ladies of the party traveled, 50 grooms in liveries of cloth of silver, numerous servants all clad, and even kitchen boys in silk and velvet, 50 war horses with saddles of gold brocade, gilded stirrups, and silk-embroidered bridles, and 500 couple of hounds with huntsmen, falcons, and falconers, together with trumpeters, players, and musicians, also a bodyguard of 100 knights and 500 infantry. But all this did not have the effect he intended. He stayed at the Medici Palace, which taught him a valuable lesson. For desirous as he had been to display to the Florentines how much greater was the wealth and splendor of Milan, he was forced by what he saw around him to acknowledge that art was superior to mere costliness, while we find him declaring that in all of Italy he had not seen so many pictures by the first masters, statues, gems, bronzes, beautiful vases, medallions, and rare books as he saw collected in the palace of the Medici. The result was that he departed at the end of his visit with a greatly increased respect for the Medici, and more inclined than he had previously been to maintain the alliance with Florence. From this time forward, we find Milan following in the steps of Florence, and its duke constantly writing to Lorenzo asking him to send him the foremost artists, and endeavoring in every way to make Milan also a center of learning and art. In July of this same year, Pope Paul II died, and was succeeded by Sixtus IV. On the election of the latter, La Signoria of Florence sent an embassy to Rome in accordance with the usual custom to congratulate him. Lorenzo formed one of the representatives of Florence and says in his memoirs that he was received by the new pope very honorably. These satisfactory relations, however, did not last. Sixtus IV soon became a pope whose crimes caused mankind to loathe the very name of the papacy, and before many years were over, he was forming a formidable plot against Lorenzo's life and the independence of the Florentine state. In June 1472 took place an event in regard to which Lorenzo's conduct has been so grossly distorted by his detractors that the episode has to receive notice. Volterra, the most turbulent of Florence's subject towns, had raised a revolt in connection with some local disputes, and on the matter being referred to Florence, had refused to submit to the decision of the government. Riots occurred in which many lives were lost, and the Florentine envoy only just escaped from the city with his life. Subsequently, Volterra sent to Florence offering submission. Some were for accepting it, but Lorenzo was against this, on the ground that the offense had been serious, that it was not the first occasion of the kind on the part of Volterra, and that the city ought to receive punishment. It may have been an error of judgment, but even this cannot be known. While even if it were so, it must be remembered that Lorenzo was at this time only 23 years old. Eventually, a force was sent against Volterra, commanded by the Duke of Urbino, neither Florence nor Venice allowing their armies to be commanded by one of their own citizens, and after a month's siege, the town surrendered and opened its gates. Then occurred the lamentable event in question. As the force entered, an affray accidentally took place between some of the troops and the populace, and this rapidly spreading grew into a sack of the town. The Duke of Urbino did everything possible to restrain his troops. He rode among them, protecting the women and children, and he hanged on the spot several of the soldiery who were foremost in inciting the rest. But on such occasions, a medieval force was practically uncontrollable, and in spite of all his efforts, the unfortunate inhabitants were for some hours subjected to outrage and plunder, as though the town had been taken by assault. Lorenzo at once proceeded to Volterra and did his utmost to mitigate the sufferings which had been endured. He has been severely condemned for this sack of Volterra, but certainly not with justice. It was the result of an accident which he could not have foreseen, and he showed by his subsequent conduct how much he deplored it. In 1473, we find Louis XI writing to Lorenzo asking him to effect a marriage between the Dauphin and Leonora of Aragon, the eldest daughter of King Ferrante of Naples. Louis XI writes to Lorenzo quite as an equal, and this, with the request itself, show what a position the latter had by this time made for himself, though as yet only 24 years of age. But the King of France was too late in this request, for the Princess Leonora had already been betrothed elsewhere, and on the 22nd of June, a very grand cavalcade, scarcely less imposing than that of the Duke of Milan 2 years before, arrived in Florence, escorting her to Ferrara to be married to Ercole I, Duke of Ferrara, who had succeeded his brother Borso in 1471. She was accompanied by 2 brothers of Duke Ercole, the lords of Capri, Mirandola, and Correggio, the dukes of Amiens and Atri, and a number of other nobles. Entering by the Porta Romana, this brilliant cortege rode through the city. Leonora, dressed all in black velvet, adorned in front with numberless pearls and jewels, with a cape and a little black hat with white feathers. They crossed the Ponte Vecchio and rode up the Palazzo della Signoria, where Leonora, without dismounting, received an address from the Signoria, and then rode on to the Medici Palace, where she stayed during her visit, and at dinner was waited upon by her two young hosts, Lorenzo and Giuliano. She stayed with them several days, during which various festivities were arranged for her amusement. Among these was a dance on the 24th of June at the Palazzo Lenzi, near the Porta Prato. In those days of inferior artificial light and small rooms, such dances generally took place during daylight and in the open air, as was the case with this one, which was given on the Prato, or open stretch of grass beside the city gate, between the palace and the Arno. Probably those who took part in it were dressed much in the same way as is related of a dance which took place on a previous occasion in the Piazza della Signoria, in which the young men were all dressed in rich green cloth, with kid boots reaching up to their thighs, and the young ladies in splendid dresses, high to the throat, and adorned with jewels and pearls. Leonora also witnessed the annual horse race, the Corso, which took place on the same day, the starting point being from the Prato, and the course being from thence by the Via della Vigna, the Mercato Vecchio, and the Corso to the Porta alla Croce. After these and other festivities, Leonora departed for Ferrara, much pleased with the two young Medici. In 1475 there took place a more than usually grand tournament, the most splendid of all the spectacles during these joyous 9 years. It was called specially Giuliano's, as that in 1469 had been called Lorenzo's, and from the elaborate preparations made for it, the interest it aroused far beyond the limits of the Florentine state, the number and importance of the visitors invited by the two young Medici to be their guests for the occasion, and the extravagantly magnificent pageant which it presented, this tournament became the event of the time. It was held in the Piazza Santa Croce, the usual place for these grand spectacles, which piazza, though it now looks so cold and gray, has seen more brilliant and gorgeous displays than perhaps any other place of the kind in Europe. Lucrezia Donati was again the queen of the tournament, and the beautiful Simonetta Cattaneo, who had lately been married at the age of 16 to Marco Vespucci, and though a Genoese by birth, was now the acknowledged belle of Florence, was the tournament's queen of beauty. The splendor of the dresses and appointments on this occasion exceeded even those of the tournament of 1469. Giuliano, now 22, wore a suit of silver armor, and his entire dress is said to have cost 8,000 florins. His and Lorenzo's helmets were designed by Verrocchio, who also painted Giuliano's standard. Giuliano's handsome looks and gallant bearing won all hearts, and whether as the result of his skill in the combat or his good looks, he was awarded the prize. This notable tournament, having formed so prominent an event, was immortalized both in poetry and in painting, and since nothing accorded with the spirit of the age, which did not contain profuse allusion to classical literature, both arts clothe what they have to say in classic dress. Poetry speaks first, by the mouth of the youthful prodigy Politian, and just as the tournament of 1469 had been immortalized by Pulci's poem thereon, so was this one of Giuliano by the still more celebrated poem of Politian, entitled La Giostra de Giuliano de Medici. Roscoe says these two tournaments are chiefly notable because they called forth two of the most celebrated poems of the 15th century, La Giostra di Lorenzo de Medici by Pulci and La Giostra di Giuliano de Medici by Politian. The latter poem contains about 1,400 lines and has been uniformly allowed to be one of the earliest productions in the revival of letters that breathes the true spirit of poetry. Still more widely known, however, is the record by which painting has commemorated this tournament, for no less than 3 of Botticelli's chief pictures refer to this celebrated tournament, and are simply his way of recording in painting the same matters which have been spoken by Politian in poetry. The Botticelli, Mori, Suo, expresses what he has to say with such a wealth of allegory that this has not always been fully recognized. These pictures are the Birth of Venus, now in the Uffizi Gallery, Florence, his Mars and Venus, now in the National Gallery, London, and his Return of Spring, now in the Accademia, Florence, all three pictures being painted for Lorenzo the Magnificent. Politian, in his poem, following the classical fashion of the day, is allusion to the tournament's Queen of Beauty, Simonetta, describes the birth of Venus. And Botticelli does the same in painting, following exactly Politian's words. How closely he has done so is well described by Mrs. Addy, who says, "The composition of the picture was evidently derived from Poliziano's poem of the Giostra. In a passage adapted from one of the Homeric hymns, the poet tells us how the newborn Aphrodite was blown by the soft breath of the zephyrs on the foam of the Aegean waves to shore. Heaven and earth, he sings, rejoice at her coming. The hours wait to welcome her and spread a star's own robe over her white limbs, while countless flowers spring up in the grass where her feet will tread. All this exquisite imagery is faithfully reproduced in Sandro's painting. He has represented his Venus, Anadyomene, laying one hand on her snowy breast, the other on her loose tresses of golden hair, a form of virginal beauty and purity, as with feet resting on the golden shell, she glides softly over the rippling surface of the waves. He has painted the winged zephyrs hovering in the air, linked fast together, blowing the goddess to the flower-strewn shore, and the shower of single roses fluttering about her form. Only instead of the 3 hours of Homer's hymn in Poliziano's poem, he shows us one fair nymph in a white robe embroidered with blue corn, flowers springing lightly forward to offer Venus a pink mantle sown with daisies. In the laurel groves along the shore, we see a courtly allusion to the laurel who sheltered the songbirds that caroled to the Tuscan spring, while in the background the eye roams across long reaches of silent sea to distant headlands, sleeping under the cool gray light of early dawn. The picture charms us by its delightful mixture of the spirit of ancient Greece with that of the Renaissance, as well as by its life and movement, and its sensation of the free air of nature. As Steinman says, we seem to hear the tremulous rustle of the laurel grove and the gentle splash of the waves. Following this, we have the second picture. The tournament is over, Giuliano has carried all before him, and rests from his fatigues, basking in beauty's smiles. Politian, in his poem alluding to Giuliano as the victor of the tournament, has told the story of Mars and Venus, and described Venus reclining in a woodland glade, robed in gold-embroidered draperies, watching Mars with limbs relaxed, lying asleep on the grass, while little goat-footed satyrs played with his armor. This scene Botticelli takes for his second picture, and as before follows closely Politian's words. And then, having devoted one picture to the tournament's Queen of Beauty and one to the victor in its mimic warfare, Botticelli makes his third picture, the most important of the three, relate to Lorenzo and his part in all this, gathering up in one view the whole subject of these pastimes. This Botticelli does with great talent, and in a manner all his own. He takes for his text the celebrated standard, which had been borne in front of Lorenzo at both his and Giuliano's tournaments, with its motto, Le temps revient. Its device of the bay tree, which had appeared dead again, putting forth its leaves, and its allusion to the new era of youth and joy which Lorenzo had inaugurated, and had likened to the return of spring after the gloomy months of winter. Making the leading thought of his picture the theme of Lorenzo's standard, Botticelli paints for him his beautiful picture, The Return of Spring, the Primavera, perhaps the most widely admired of all Botticelli's pictures. As before, Botticelli connects his picture with the recent tournament by introducing Giuliano and Simonetta, but he wishes to refer not only to this one tournament, but to all these pastimes, to their having been inaugurated by and taking place under the fostering care of Lorenzo, and also to the latter's talents as a poet, in which domain he is already beginning to earn a great reputation. And so Botticelli depicts for us a scene of light-hearted, youthful joy representing the return of spring, and by his great talent contrives that the entire picture shall speak of Lorenzo, and breathe the very spirit of the poems in which the latter had sung of the joys of Maytime in Tuscany. Shielded from rough winds and scorching sun by a grove of orange trees, backed by the ever-present laurel, Queen Venus, Simonetta, stands presiding over the return of spring to Tuscany. The Graces dance before her. From out a laurel grove at her side, the 3 spring months, March, April, May, or it may be Zephyr, Fertility, and Flora, come bringing flowers of every hue. Mercury, Galliano, scatters the clouds of winter. And the little blind god of love aims his arrows recklessly around. Lorenzo's tournament motto of Le Temps Revient could be written below the picture as its name. So beautifully does Botticelli bring it, the occasion on which it was used, the meaning which it had, and Lorenzo's talent for poetry describing the beauties of nature, all in one glance before our eyes. Some consider this picture Botticelli's masterpiece, while others would give that honor to his Madonna of the Magnificat. The verdict will depend chiefly upon the temperament of the observer, but whether The Return of Spring can be considered his masterpiece or not, none can fail to praise what has been well termed his rhythmic grace, as well as the surpassing art with which Botticelli has made it speak of Lorenzo, his acts, his poetry, and the motto by which he signified the introduction of a brighter era. But dark clouds were coming on the horizon, which were long to overcast all these bright scenes of joy, putting an end forever to Lorenzo's youth and all the happy times which he and Galliano had enjoyed together. In April 1476, before Politian had finished his poem, or Botticelli had even begun to paint his 3 pictures, the tournament's poor queen of beauty, Simonetta de Vespucci, whose lovely face looks at us so wistfully in Botticelli's Birth of Venus, and of whom Politian says she was so sweet and charming that all men praised her and no women abused her, was dead, being carried off by rapid consumption after a few weeks of illness. Lorenzo, who was then at Pisa superintending his new university, and had sent his own physician to attend her and to furnish him with daily bulletins when he heard the news, went out into the calm spring night to walk with a friend, and as he was speaking of the dead lady, he suddenly stopped and gazed at a star which had never before seemed to him so brilliant. "See," he exclaimed, "either the soul of that most gentle lady hath been transformed into that new star, or else hath it been joined together thereunto." Then followed in December 1476 the murder of the Duke of Milan, Galeazzo Sforza, which upset the balance of power in Italy, and changing all political relations involved Lorenzo in serious anxieties. And soon afterwards came the terrible Pazzi conspiracy, and the bright, handsome Galliano, Lorenzo's constant companion in work and play, and on whose sound sense he had grown greatly to rely, was foully murdered, and Lorenzo himself plunged into a serious war and many troubles. The celebrated conspiracy which had these results originated at Rome with Pope Sixtus IV and his nephews of the Riario family. They gained, as their accomplices, the Pazzi, at this time the leading family amongst the nobles in Florence, and the conspiracy has taken its name from them, though they were not the chief authors of the plot. Sixtus IV, the first of 3 popes who in this age attained an evil preeminence, was a fisherman by birth, and took the name of the Della Rovere family. His sister married a Riario, and of him it has been said that he was the first pope who, for the sake of a founding family, sacrificed every interest of the church, and waded deep in crime and bloodshed for this purpose. The chief political feature of his pontificate is a constant struggle to rob all, right and left, of their possessions to enrich his rapacious nephews. He made himself hated in Rome, above all for his cruel treatment of the Colonna family, whom he pursued with relentless ferocity, and of all his crimes, this atrocious murder of the head of that family, the proto-notary Lorenzo Colonna, in order to wring from them the surrender of their estates, has made his name forever odious. Sixtus IV, urged on by Girolamo Riario, the most evil of his nephews, desired to seize upon Florence in order to give that state to Girolamo. That this involved the murder of the 2 Medici brothers was a mere detail. The Pazzi, on the other hand, though they desired to exterminate the Medici, had no intention of allowing the Riario to obtain Florence afterwards. Thus did these two bands of criminals combine for their common object of a treacherous double murder, each of them determined to outwit the other when that should have been effected. The arrangements took some time, but eventually the two parties hatched at Rome, early in 1478, the plot known as the Pazzi conspiracy, certainly with the full cognizance of the Pope, even though it may be true that he did not know all the details. For these he left to his nephew, Girolamo Riario, the chief originator of the plot, and did not desire to know them so long as the result, the removal of the two Medici, was achieved. In fact, without the Pope's full concurrence, Girolamo Riario would never have undertaken an affair involving so many risks, which might, without that support, bring him no profit. Troops under Niccolo da Tolentino and Lorenzo Giustini were sent to occupy points on Florence's frontiers at Todi, Città di Castello, Imola, and near Perugia, and arrangements made for their marching upon Florence, while that city should be in the state of confusion and helplessness which would result from the murder of the two Medici. As has been remarked, for such extensive movements, the Pope's assent and cooperation were essential. The principal movers in the business were Girolamo Riario, who was to obtain the state of Florence, Francesco Salviati, Archbishop designate of Pisa, who was promised that he would be made Archbishop of Florence if the attempt succeeded, the young Cardinal, Raffaello Riario, the Pope's grandnephew, who was sent to Florence to represent Girolamo and the Pazzi family. The latter were very numerous. Jacopo de' Pazzi, who was head of the family, had two brothers, and between them they had 10 grown-up sons, besides many daughters. Cosimo, foreseeing the enmity of the Pazzi, had arranged a marriage between one of these nephews of Jacopo de' Pazzi and his granddaughter, Bianca, Lorenzo's sister. But when the time came, this did not protect Lorenzo from the Pazzi. When all the plans and the conspirators were ready, the Archbishop Salviati came to Florence, bringing with him Montesecco, a mercenary soldier in the Pope's employ, who was to play the chief part in the murder, and other conspirators. At the same time, the young cardinal, Raffaello Riario, also came to Florence, ostensibly on a visit to Jacopo de' Pazzi. The cowardly Girolamo Riario, though he was the chief author of the plot, and was to be the person to benefit by it, took care to remain out of harm's way in Rome. Lorenzo and Giuliano were at the time staying at the charming Medici villa a few miles out of Florence on the slope of the hill of Fiesole. Raffaello Riario and his retinue stayed with Jacopo de' Pazzi at his neighboring villa of Laveggi. They were invited by the two Medici brothers to a grand banquet to take place at the Medici villa on Saturday, the 25th of April, and the first plan formed by the conspirators was to poison the two brothers at this banquet. The entertainment took place, but Giuliano, being indisposed, was unable to be present, so the plan fell through. The Pazzi then told Lorenzo that the young Cardinal Riario was anxious to see the treasures of the Medici palace, upon which Lorenzo invited him and his retinue to stay with him there for the Sunday night, when the cardinal intended being present at High Mass in the cathedral, whereupon the conspirators laid the plan that after attending Mass and returning to the Medici palace for dinner, their two young hosts should be murdered as they rose from the table. In accordance with the above invitation, the party removed to the Medici palace, but on the Sunday morning it was found that though Giuliano would be at Mass, he was still too unwell to be at the midday dinner, so again another plan had to be formed. Nor could any delay be allowed, since on the evening the troops of Niccolo da Tolentino and Giustini would be at the gates of the city. It was therefore hastily decided that the murder should take place at the service in the cathedral, where it was known that there would be a great crowd, which would facilitate the escape of the murderers. Montesecco, however, declined to take part in this plan, as he refused to add sacrilege to murder. So in his place were substituted two priests who were among the conspirators, Antonio Maffei and Stefano de Bagnone, who had no such scruples. Meanwhile, in the Medici palace, every preparation was made for the banquet. The rare silver, maiolica, and precious vases were brought out, and the cortile, which Donatello's medallions and statuary adorned, were arranged for the entertainment of so distinguished a company. It shows somewhat of the general estimation in which the Medici were held in Florence, that though for several days danger of this kind, either by poison or dagger, had been all around Lorenzo and Giuliano, both they, their family, and their numerous retainers should have been so entirely without the smallest suspicion of any danger. It was this entire absence of suspicion on the part of the two brothers which caused the plot to come so very near to succeeding. Towards midday, on the Sunday morning, 26th of April, Lorenzo left the Medici palace, walking with his guest, the young cardinal, Raffaello Riario, to the cathedral. After a short interval, Giuliano followed, accompanied by Francesco de Pazzi and Bernardo Bandini. As they walked, Francesco de Pazzi pretended affection, put his arm around Giuliano's waist to ascertain whether he wore a coat of mail under his clothes, which he found he did not. Giuliano on that day was entirely unarmed, not even wearing a sword, having hurt his leg in an accident. The moment which the conspirators had fixed upon to carry out this diabolical murder during High Mass of the two young men whose hospitality they were enjoying was that of the elevation of the host. This moment, says a historian of the time, being chosen both by reason of the impossibility of mistaking it, and also on account of the bending attitude of worship, which it is the habit of every one in the church to assume at that solemn moment in the service. It was this which caused the mercenary soldier Montesecco to draw back from the plot, he being appalled, ruffian as he was, at the blasphemy of choosing such a moment for so great a crime. And this was the actual cause of the failure of the plot. For his part had been that of murdering Lorenzo, and the two priests substituted in his place, being unused to arms, bungled their work, where those told off to do the same to Giuliano, Bernardo Bandini and Francesco de Pazzi, succeeded only too well. In the crowded cathedral, the brothers were, according to the plan, separated. At the fatal moment, Giuliano, unarmed, was standing at the northern side of the choir, not far from the door leading to the Via de' Servi, while Lorenzo was standing at the south side of the choir. Giuliano, furiously attacked by Bernardo Bandini and Francesco de Pazzi, fell dead at once where he stood, his body being stabbed again and again as it lay on the ground until it had 19 wounds. At the same time, Maffei and Stefano attacked Lorenzo, but being less prompt than Bandini, only succeeded in giving him a wound on the neck. Lorenzo, with much presence of mind, immediately threw off his cloak, wrapped it around his left arm as a shield, and drawing his sword, beat off his assailants. He then leaped over the low rail which encircled the choir, and running along across in front of the high altar, took refuge in the sacristy. Bandini, having slain Giuliano, rushed towards the sacristy to attack Lorenzo, killing on the way with one blow Francesco Nori, a devoted adherent of the Medici, who interposed to prevent him from reaching Lorenzo. Bellizien, with one or two others of his friends, had followed Lorenzo, closed the heavy bronze doors of the sacristy to Bandini's face, while Antonio Ridolfi sucked Lorenzo's wound lest the weapon should have been poisoned. The whole church was at once in an uproar, the people, when they knew what had happened, being ready to tear in pieces those guilty of the crime. For the moment, however, the latter, in the general confusion, escaped out of the church, while the young cardinal, Raffaello Riario, took refuge at the high altar. One of Lorenzo's party in the sacristy climbed up into the organ loft, and saw Giuliano's body lying dead at the north side of the choir, and that the conspirators had fled, this being the first intimation that Lorenzo had of what had happened to his brother. And after a little time, Lorenzo, wounded and in deep distress at his brother's cruel fate, was escorted home by his friends. Meanwhile, the other and larger portion of the conspirators were occupied at the Palazzo della Signoria. The plot, as arranged, was a most formidable one, eminently calculated to paralyze Florence and render her powerless to resist the troops of Niccolo da Tolentino and Giustini, who should in a few hours be entering the city. For the plan had been that while those told off to that work carried out the murder of the two brothers in the cathedral, the principal band of the conspirators, headed by the Archbishop Salviati, should proceed to the Palazzo della Signoria, and having gained admittance to the council chambers, should seize the government, killing all members of the Signoria who resisted. But on the entrance of the Archbishop and his following, the Gonfaloniere Petrucci, who in this crisis showed himself a decidedly strong man, suspected something wrong. He therefore kept the Archbishop and his party in play for a short time, detaining the Archbishop in his own private room while he quietly set out to ascertain if there was anything unusual going on in the city. In a few minutes came the news of the tragedy which had occurred in the cathedral, and with it the gathering noise of the furious people, who, while Jacopo de' Pazzi and others of that family strove to rouse them to rise against the Medici, and rode through the streets crying out Libertà, were refusing to shout as instigated, Abbasso le palle, but instead were shouting furiously, Vivano le palle. The Gonfaloniere, with great resolution, seized the Archbishop and promptly hanged him from the corner window on the north side of the Palazzo della Signoria, the corner window of the great council hall, and with him, from the adjacent windows, 5 of his fellow conspirators, while the rest were slain on the staircase. Within a half hour, 26 bodies were encumbering the staircase of the Palazzo della Signoria, and half a dozen more were dangling from the windows. The remainder of the conspirators were hunted through the city by the enraged people, whose hatred against them was beyond all bounds, and none who fell into their hands were spared even to be handed over to the Signoria for execution. They had not only killed Giuliano and attempted to kill Lorenzo, but they had also made a formidable endeavor by force of arms, and with the aid of foreign troops, to seize Florence by a coup de main, and all these acts together roused the people to frenzy. They surrounded the Medici palace and clamored to see Lorenzo. Wounded as he was, he came out and addressed them, assuring them that he was only slightly hurt, and exhorting them not to execute private vengeance on the perpetrators of this deed, but to reserve their animosity for those foreign enemies of their country who had instigated it. But they paid no heed to his admonition, and all suspected of complicity in the plot were pursued through the streets and slaughtered wherever captured. Their mangled remains were dragged about by the infuriated mob, whose rage was not satisfied until about 80 persons had been massacred. Nor was the feeling confined to the city. For days afterwards, the country people flocked into Florence, coming, they said, to protect Lorenzo. But in the Medici palace was deep and bitter mourning for the bright and justly loved Giuliano, the idol of his family, and mournful preparations for the solemn public funeral to be held in the family church of San Lorenzo. Nor, when the Florentine people had had time to recover from this first excitement, did the popular wrath abate. It became less wild, but more determined. Jacopo de' Pazzi had escaped to the village of Castagno, but was seized and brought back by the villagers and executed by the Signoria. The same fate met Francesco de' Pazzi, one of the 2 murderers of Giuliano, his cousin Renato de' Pazzi, Montesecco, and the 2 priests, Maffei and Stefano. Guglielmo de' Pazzi, brother of Francesco and husband of Lorenzo's favorite sister Bianca, would probably also have lost his life had not Lorenzo, on his sister's account, intervened on his behalf. In consequence, Guglielmo was merely banished to a short distance from Florence. The remaining 7 of the 10 sons or nephews of Jacopo de' Pazzi were sentenced either to imprisonment for longer or shorter periods or to banishment. Vespucci also richly deserved hanging, but was let off with 2 years' imprisonment. Bernardo Bandini, the other murderer of Giuliano, escaped to Constantinople. There, however, he was seized by the Sultan and sent back in chains to Florence. On his arrival, the Signoria at once ordered him to be executed in the Bargello. The indignation of the people, not all of it on account of the attempt against the Medici, but also on account of the effrontery of such an endeavor to seize upon their state as if a mere spoil of war, caused them to seek for every possible method which they could use to devise to brand with deserved infamy those who had perpetrated this deed. By a public decree of the Signoria, The name and arms of the Pazzi family were ordered to be forever suppressed. Their palace and all places in the city named after them were given other names. All persons contracting marriage with any of that family were declared prohibited from all offices in the Republic. The ancient ceremony on Easter Eve of conducting the sacred fire to the house of the Pazzi was abolished. An artist was employed at the public expense to represent on the walls of the Bargello the bodies of the traitors to the Republic suspended, as a mark of infamy, by the feet. And a medal was struck, by the order of the Signoria, representing the choir of the cathedral, the heads of Lorenzo and Giuliano, and the attacks made upon them. While the fury of the Florentines was thus at a white heat against those who had perpetrated this crime and come so near bringing their country under such a yoke as Sixtus IV had intended, Lorenzo showed in the midst of the frenzy of his city one trait which is deserving of notice, and it was an inherited one. Whether he had felt that, notwithstanding the part in the matter which the one member of the Riario family who had come to Florence had played, the latter had been only a tool in the hands of older men, or whatever the cause, it was to Lorenzo that the young cardinal, Raffaello Riario, entirely owed the saving of his life. When the uproar in the cathedral took place, the young cardinal took refuge, as already noted, at the high altar, whence he dared not stir. Lorenzo, on reaching home, sent a party of his retainers to protect him and to conduct him to the Medici Palace, the sole place in the city where he could be in safety. There he kept him hidden for some days until the violence of the people had cooled down, and then sent him away in secrecy to Rome. Lorenzo showed similar magnanimity in saving the lives of Raffaello Maffei, the brother of the priest who had attempted to murder him, and of Averardo Salviati, a near relation of the archbishop who had taken so prominent a part in the plot. Such, then, was the Pazzi conspiracy. It differs in no way from the most brutal highway murder and robbery except in its consummate treachery and the high position of its authors. Yet it will scarcely be credited that some writers have styled it a praiseworthy act. Thus, for instance, we find Sismondi crediting the chief actors in the Pazzi conspiracy with noble motives. He sees in the conduct of Sixtus IV, whose motive is well known to have been solely the desire to seize Tuscany for his greedy nephew, elevation of sentiment and a desire for the independence of Italy. And he regards the Pazzi as noble patriots striving for the liberty of Florence. The Medici have quite enough faults to answer for without their history being distorted in this preposterous fashion. The judgment of a more balanced writer is as follows. The Pope and his nephew attempted to overthrow the Medici rule because it was a bar to enlarging the temporal authority of the one and to the personal ambition of the other. The Pazzi were perhaps unconscious that they were being used as tools for the attainment of these ends, and had no doubt their own ideas as to the future government of Florence, but there is not a tittle of evidence that they were actuated by a love of liberty. Their conduct throughout seems to have been purely vindictive. It was the Medici, and not the Pazzi, who in the past had been on the side of free institutions. The supposition that the Florentines would have preferred the rule of the Pazzi to that of the Medici is ridiculous, or Jacopo de Pazzi's shouts of Liberta, Liberta would not have been answered with the Palle, Palle of the multitude. In truth, there has seldom been a conspiracy which was instigated throughout by meaner motives. Thus did this celebrated conspiracy fail, and the Medici were more popular than ever, and have weathered the fourth and most formidable attempt to destroy them. While Lorenzo, as a result of this attempt, gained much additional strength for the war which was now before him, in the knowledge that he had a united people at his back. But Lorenzo's youth ended with the death of his much-loved brother. There are no more pageants and festivities, but henceforward war, politics, and literary labors, with field sports as the only relaxation. Giuliano, the youngest of the 5 children of Piero il Gottoso and Lucrezia Tornabuoni, was, unlike his brother Lorenzo, exceedingly good-looking. He He was gifted with considerable abilities, and for his many enduring qualities was greatly beloved, not only in his own family, but also by the people of Florence. Before his early death, he had already shown on several occasions that he possessed plenty of political capacity and could give valuable advice to his brother. Mr. Armstrong, describing his character, says, "He was the darling of high and low, the most attractive of all the Medici. His passion was the chase. He was a bold rider, a skillful jouster, eminent in jumping and wrestling. Yet he was no brutal athlete. He loved pictures, music, and everything that was beautiful. He loved poetry that told of love. He composed verses in his mother tongue, full of weight and sentiment. He talked brightly and thought soundly, delighted in witty and playful company, but hated above all men who lied or bore a grudge for wrongs. Faithful and high-minded, regardful of religious forms and moral decencies, he was ever ready to render service or perform a courteous act. In his relations to his brother, whom he worshipped, there was no sign of jealousy. After the terrible tragedy of his murder at High Mass in the cathedral, the city long missed the well-known figure, tall and well-proportioned, the olive-tinted features lighted by bright eyes, the long lock on the forehead, and the shock of black hair thrust back upon his neck. He had a grand public funeral in the great church of the Medici family, San Lorenzo, and there was no hypocrisy in the great grief manifested by the people. The relations which existed between these two brothers is one of the pleasantest things in the history of the Medici. At that epoch, jealousy between two brothers placed in such a position as Lorenzo and Giuliano were as the normal state of things. That it was entirely absent in their case speaks well for both of them, and it is an indication of Lorenzo's character and of what his conduct in the minor relations of life must have been, that he should have never given cause for any feeling of jealousy in a younger brother so nearly his equal in ability and his superior in good looks, and that on the contrary the latter should have worshipped him, or again that Lorenzo from his side should never have felt jealousy at the admiration and popularity so universally bestowed on Giuliano, and much exceeding that accorded to himself. Giuliano was 25 at the time of his death. He left an illegitimate son born just at that time. Lorenzo took the child and brought him up as one of his own sons, and this child became the next generation, the well-known Giulio de Medici, afterwards Clement VII. Giuliano, like all previous members of the family except Cosimo, was buried in the old sacristy in San Lorenzo. But about 80 years afterwards, his remains were removed to the new sacristy, which had at that time become the principal burial place of the family. It has always been felt suitable that these two brothers, between whom so strong an affection existed in life, should be buried together. When Lorenzo died, his body was laid in the same grave with Giuliano's. The remains were subsequently removed to the new sacristy together, and there they still lie in the same tomb. When in October 1895 Lorenzo's and Giuliano's tomb was opened, the reason why the latter was so instantly killed became for the first time apparent. The accounts of the murder had always mentioned that his body received a large number of wounds, most of them given after he was already dead, but no mention of a wound on the head was made in any of the accounts. When, however, the tomb was opened, more than 400 years afterwards, it was at once observed that Giuliano's head had an enormous sword cut extending along the whole of the top of the skull, thus fully accounting for his falling dead at once where he stood. Evidently, Giuliano, at the elevation of the host, had adopted the bending attitude on which the plot relied, and the murderer, Bandini, had taken full advantage of the opportunity it gave, and struck Giuliano down, without his having a chance of defending himself from the blow, by the stroke delivered with great force on his bare head. Sixtus IV was furious at the failure of the conspiracy. It added fuel to the flame that Florence should have dared to hang his subordinate, the Archbishop Salviati, and put to death his hired agents, Montesecco and his companions. He promptly declared war against Florence and induced the King of Naples and other states to join him. He confiscated the Medici Bank in Rome and sent an envoy to the Florentine state to demand that Lorenzo should be surrendered to his vengeance. The reply of the Signoria is significant. You say that Lorenzo is a tyrant and command us to expel him, but how are we free if thus compelled to obey your commands? You call him a tyrant, the majority of the Florentines call him their defender. But the Pope did more than declare war. He excommunicated the entire Tuscan state. The document drawn up by Sixtus IV on this occasion is a curiosity in this kind of literature. In it, he anathematized not only Lorenzo, whom he styled the child of iniquity and the nursling of perdition, but also the Gonfalonieri and all the members of the Signoria of Florence. The complete unrighteousness of the act is manifest. Because his criminal attempt had failed, and because the government of a neighboring state had executed those who had murdered their ruler's brother, attempted to murder himself, and endeavored treacherously to seize their country, therefore the people of that country were to be visited with a penalty in spiritual affairs. It was a travesty of the whole meaning of excommunication. Thus was the greater part of Italy stirred up to attack Lorenzo, who justly remarked that his only fault was that he had not been murdered. But the temper of the Florentines was so thoroughly roused, no submission was thought of, and Florence prepared herself for a serious war against the whole power which the Pope was able to bring to bear. And here occurred a remarkable incident, interesting as showing how the temper of men's minds was changing, and as a forerunner of the Reformation, now fast approaching in the next generation. At a period on which we are now entering, corruption and vice were being spread over Europe from Rome as a center. The Church at large cried out against it, but none could see from whence any reform could come. Thus we find a preacher of the order of St. Dominic preaching in the year 1484, saying, "The world cries out for a council, but how can one be obtained in the present state of the heads of the Church? No human power avails any longer to reform the Church through a council, and God himself must come to our aid in some way unknown to us." But in a way undreamt of by the preacher, that aid was already on the road. The new learning was slowly but surely leading men up to that great movement which was to reform the Church. Writings of the long past, unearthed chiefly through the labors of the Medici in the cause of learning, were beginning to be the common property of all men, and the result was like a revelation to the men of that age. They learnt when and how the claims of the papacy had originated, how often and how effectively they had, in the early centuries, been repudiated by the Church, and how those claims themselves had gradually become far more wide and sweeping in character than when at first tentatively put forward, and how in many instances they had only made their way owing to the political circumstances of Europe. But men learnt more than even this. As these researchers of scholars into the writings of the past proceeded, it began to be seen that an immense falsehood had been perpetrated. There loomed before men's eyes the most gigantic fraud which the world has ever seen. In the latter half of the 15th century, men gradually learned that whereas these papal claims had for centuries been based upon three great historical documents, these were, all of them, from end to end, colossal forgeries concocted in the Roman Curia during the darkness of the 8th and 9th centuries. The forged donation of Constantine, the forged donation of Pepin, and that which has obtained in history the name the forged decretals, all three now acknowledged by all Europe, including the Church of Rome itself, to have been what the scholars of the Renaissance found them out to be, forgeries. None, in fact, possessed of any scholarship could read them without at once seeing that they were so, their historical errors and inconsistencies being so gross. But they had sufficed for their purpose during an illiterate age. This huge fraud had misled the whole of Western Europe from the 8th to the 15th century, and the entire papal edifice was erected thereon. And then, says a modern historian, came a scholar of the Renaissance, Laurentius Valla, and uttered a few words of caustic comment, and pricked the bubble which had befooled the world for 7 centuries. And the gin shrank back into the bottle and was hurled into the depths of the sea. It was as though, nay, far more than as though, Magna Charta was found to be a forgery. The pricking of this great bubble, joined to all the other knowledge which the new learning supplied, was bound, when time elapsed, for the information to spread over the countries of northern Europe, to bring about the Reformation. For as soon as it became known to most educated men that the entire papal claim was based upon a colossal fraud, the revolt of other national churches from the usurped supremacy of the Church of Rome was a certainty. But that time was not yet. As yet, we are only at the stage when these things are becoming known to a considerable number of men in Tuscany, and at an incident which was but a local and temporary forerunner of the great convulsion. It is an incident little known, but whose importance is shown by the strenuous efforts subsequently made by the Church of Rome to destroy all trace of it. On receipt of the Pope's bull of excommunication, the whole of the Tuscan bishops assembled in council in the Cathedral of Florence, justified the action of the state, and not only appealed to a general council against the interdict, but excommunicated the Pope. Nor was there anything irregular in this action of the Church of Tuscany. It was an action which went back to the times when, had any bishop acted as Sixtus IV had done, the churches of other parts of Christendom would have refused to hold communion with him, or with his church, until it had purged itself of such a bishop. And it was only from the long ignorance which had reigned in these matters that the bold action of the Church of Tuscany took men's breath away. And if we inquire where the Tuscan Church got the idea of action, which had been unknown in Europe for more than 8 centuries, the answer is plain. It was undoubtedly Tuscany's new learning which emboldened the Church of Tuscany to take the course it did, strong in the knowledge that it was on solid ground in taking action which any appeal to the early centuries of the life of the Catholic Church would substantiate. But the Church of Tuscany did not stop here. It made use of the newly discovered art of printing, and printed its sentence of excommunication of the Pope and distributed copies thereof to other national churches of Europe. This, to a world accustomed to tremble at a Pope's censures, seemed a still more terrible act of lawlessness, but nothing daunted Tuscany. The whole of the clergy held with their bishops, and the papal excommunication was treated as a dead letter throughout that state. In the war which followed, Florence was greatly overmatched. She had to face a powerful combination including not only Rome and Naples, but also both of her 2 ancient rivals, Siena and Lucca. Besides Urbino and other minor states, the Pope exerting all his power to make all states join him. Florence was repeatedly defeated in the field and lost town after town. At length, after nearly 2 years fighting, the position being most gloomy, Lorenzo took a remarkable step. Leaving the conduct of affairs in the hands of the Gonfaloniere Tommaso Soderini, he set out by himself for Naples to try diplomacy instead of force of arms, thus putting himself into the hands of his enemy in the hope of thereby saving his country. It was a dangerous step, for the Pope was as vindictive as ever, and all knew the unreliable character of King Ferrante of Naples. On his way to Pisa, Lorenzo wrote to the Signoria, explaining his object thus: "In the dangerous circumstances in which our city is placed, it was more necessary to act than to deliberate. I therefore mean, with your permission, to proceed directly to Naples, conceiving that as I am the person chiefly aimed at by our enemies, I may, by delivering myself into their hands, perhaps be the means of restoring peace to my fellow citizens." In reply, he received from the Signoria a letter conferring on him official authority to negotiate with the King of Naples. Sailing from the little port of Vada in the Maremma, Lorenzo reached Naples on the 18th of December. There is charm of manner, combined with the masterly sketch which he set before the king of the politics of Italy, showing him the precariousness of Ludovico Sforza's position at Milan, the unreliability of Venice, the changing policy of the papacy, which varied with each new pope, and that the friendship of none was so valuable to him as that of Florence. So worked so great a change that the enmity of King Ferrante was turned into friendship. Lorenzo returned in triumph to Florence in March 1480 with a perfect ovation, the people embracing each other for joy, the citizens declaring that his tact and personal influence had proved stronger than all the military force of the enemy, and that all that had been lost in the war had been recovered by his wisdom and judgment. The Pope raged furiously and did his utmost to continue the war, but one ally after another withdrew from him, and eventually he had to give in, remove his interdict, and make peace with Florence. This return in triumph, bringing peace with honor, where all had been so gloomy when he went away, was always considered by the Florentines the chief event of Lorenzo's life. And just as Botticelli had immortalized the roseate joys of those earlier years, before the tragedy of the Pazzi conspiracy put an end to them and brought storm and trouble, so now the same painter immortalized the triumph of these sterner years. This Botticelli, always allegorical, does by his picture of Pallas subduing the centaur, now in the Pitti Palace, one of the most admired of his pictures. The centaur, emblem of crime and war, and typifying the iniquitous Pazzi conspiracy and the unrighteous war brought upon Florence as its result, cowers before the victorious goddess of wisdom, who, with Lorenzo's private crest of the interlaced diamond rings covering her dress and wreathed with laurel, turns her back on the Bay of Naples, and setting her face towards the hill country of Tuscany, leads the spirit of war captive, thus representing the triumph of wisdom and peace in the person of Lorenzo, and the honor accorded to him by a grateful country. In this manner did Lorenzo weather the storm which came upon him when he was 30 years old, through the double trial of the formidable conspiracy to murder him and the disastrous war which grew out of it. We get a glimpse of how severely it had tried him from his words when apologizing for turning to literature as a relaxation amidst of much trouble of mind. He writes, "I shall therefore only say that my sufferings have been very severe, the authors of them having been men of great authority and talents, and fully determined to accomplish by every means in their power my total ruin. Whilst I, on the other hand, having nothing to oppose to these formidable enemies but youth and inexperience, saving indeed the assistance which I received from divine goodness, was reduced to such an extreme of misfortune that I had at one and the same time to labor under the excommunication of my soul and the dispersion of my property, to contend with endeavors to divest me of my authority in the state, to meet attempts to introduce discord into my family, and to sustain frequent plots to deprive me of my life, insomuch that I should at one time have thought death itself a less evil than those with which I had to contend. In this unfortunate situation it is surely not to be wondered at if I endeavored to alleviate my anxiety by turning to more agreeable subjects of meditation." This great diplomatic victory was the turning point in Lorenzo's career. Up to this time he had not gained the autocratic power which he sought, but from this moment it was entirely his. The Florentines were ready to accord any honor to the man who had first defended their country from seizure by an unscrupulous Roman despot, and from subjugation to the latter's tyrannical rule, and then, though overmatched in strength, had foiled all that enemy's attacks and restored peace without any loss of territory. Lorenzo might undoubtedly, if he would, at this juncture have made himself sovereign ruler of Florence in name as well as in fact. But he knew his countrymen too well to do so, knowing that all his popularity would wane if he adopted that position, and he had the wisdom to be content with the power without the insignia of sovereignty. The kind of rule which he established, that combination of an autocracy with a democracy, will always be held in disfavor by political theorists, but the practical results proved its entire correctness. The prosperity and power of Florence went up with a bound. Every state desired alliance with her, while foreign courts eagerly sought Lorenzo's advice and assistance. Even the Sultan was impressed by his importance and sent him costly presents, among other things a giraffe, which must have been somewhat of an embarrassment in Florence. At the same time, Florence's commerce immensely increased. Her ships, built in her port of Pisa, trading to the Black Sea, Asia Minor, Africa, Spain, England, France, and Flanders. And with the spread of her commerce increased also her influence as the center of art and learning. The pride which the Florentines took in all this is brought home to us when we find Giovanni Rucellai in detailing in his memoirs a long list of personal benefits for which he desires to offer up thanks to the Almighty, amongst them thanking God that he was a native of Florence, the greatest city in the world, and lived in the days of the magnificent Medici. During the first 11 years of Lorenzo's rule, the chief events in other countries were as follows. In France, from 1468 to 1477, Louis XI was mainly occupied in a long struggle with Charles the Bold, the great Duke of Burgundy. The latter was in every way the reverse of his mean and crafty antagonist, and a far nobler spirit, while his wise reforms for the good of his country and his strong and enlightened government made him the leading ruler of his time. The struggle between him and Louis XI continued with varying success until 1477. Charles the Bold was killed at the Battle of Nancy. He left an only child, Mary of Burgundy, who inherited all her father's immense territories. Meanwhile, Louis XI, having exterminated all the greater nobles in France, had destroyed the feudal system in that country, and in its place had established a standing army. This was the first standing army created in Europe, and its possession in an age when nothing of the kind existed in any other country greatly increased Louis XI's strength. In Germany, the Emperor Frederick III succeeded in 1477 in arranging a marriage between his son, Maximilian, Archduke of Austria, and Mary of Burgundy, the sole heiress of Charles the Bold, by which Austria gained an accession of territory extending from Holland to Switzerland. This marriage caused a great change in the state of Europe. To its due, the rise of the House of Austria, and we are told it begins the era of the larger politics of modern times. In this matter, Louis XI entirely overreached himself. The rich and extensive territories which Mary of Burgundy inherited stretched along the most exposed frontier of France. By a continued course of elaborate intrigues, Louis, while amusing the young Duchess with a proposal for a marriage with his son the Dauphin, which he never intended to carry out, sent troops into her country, corrupted its leading men, and then betrayed them to execution, played everyone false in turn, and was rapidly seizing her whole territory. To save themselves from him, the states of Flanders secretly negotiated with the emperor for the above marriage, which between their young sovereign, Mary, and his son, and in 1478, 6 months after her father's death, Mary of Burgundy gave herself and all her wide territories to the young Maximilian, and Louis XI, to his great disgust, had to disgorge. In England, the Wars of the Roses still continued, debarring that country from taking any part in the politics of Europe. In Spain, in 1469, the year that Lorenzo's rule in Florence began, took place the marriage between Ferdinand, King of Aragon, and Isabella, Queen of Castile, whereby for the first time Spain entered as one country into European politics, this marriage uniting the northern half of that country, though the Moors still held the southern portion. In Milan, after the death in 1476 of the Duke Galeazzo Sforza, his Duchess Bona of Savoy governed for a time on behalf of her son. In 1480, however, her late husband's brother, Ludovico Sforza, commonly known as Il Moro, owing to his swarthy complexion, managed to banish her, placed her 12-year-old son, Gian Galeazzo, on the throne and proceeded to govern in his name. And as Il Moro failed to continue the policy of his father and brother in maintaining a close friendship with Florence, this made a material difference to Lorenzo the Magnificent in his labors to preserve the balance of power in Italy. In southern Italy, in 1480, just after Lorenzo had concluded his treaty of peace with Naples, Muhammad II, who after his capture in Constantinople in 1453 had subdued in succession Servia, Bosnia, Albania, and Greece, proceeded to extend his conquests to Italy, and attacked and captured Otranto, massacring the inhabitants. This capture of Otranto by the Turks created great consternation in Italy and was a principal inducement to Sixtus IV to conclude the peace with Florence already noted. Florence agreed to maintain a fleet of 15 galleys for employment against the Turks until they should be expelled from Italy. For the next 4 years after his peace with Naples and the Pope, Lorenzo was continuously occupied in striving to create a general peace in Italy, Sixtus IV, still endeavoring to seize upon various states for his nephew, Girolamo, kept Italy in a constant state of war, in which Milan, Venice, Ferrara, and Naples were all involved. But Lorenzo succeeded in keeping Florence out of it, though for some time his labors to bring all states to peace were without success. In 1482, Lorenzo's mother, Lucrezia Tornabuoni, died. She had lived to see her elder son's triumph over the cruel enemies who had slain her younger son, and to witness the former's growing power as the needle of the Italian compass. In the many troubles and anxieties of the previous 4 years, Lorenzo had received much counsel and support from her, and he felt her death greatly. Speaking of it, he says, "I have lost not only my mother, but my one refuge from many of my troubles, a comfort in my labors, and one who saved me from many of those labors." In 1488, Lorenzo's second son, Giovanni, though only 7 years old, was admitted to minor orders with a view to training him for high office in the church. And at the same time, Louis XI, with whom Lorenzo's influence had now become great, conferred on Giovanni, in accordance with the bad though not infrequent custom of the age, the archbishopric of Aix-en-Provence. It's curious and illustrative of the prevailing views on such points in reading Lorenzo's own account of the matter in his memoirs to note how he evidently saw nothing incongruous in the matter. He says, "On the 19th of May we received the intelligence that the King of France had presented to my son Giovanni the abbey of Fontedolce. On the 31st we heard from Rome that the Pope had confirmed the grant and had rendered him capable of holding it, a benefice, he being now 7 years old. On the 1st of June, Giovanni accompanied me from Poggio a Caiano to Florence, where he was confirmed by the Bishop of Arezzo in the chapel of our family, and received the tonsura, and from thenceforth was called Messer Giovanni. The next day we returned to Poggio. On the 8th June arrived advices from the King of France that he had conferred upon Messer Giovanni the archbishopric of Aix-en-Provence. In 1484, all states except the Pope, being weary of the war, Lorenzo's efforts were at length successful, and a peace was concluded at Bagnolo between Naples, Milan, and Venice. The news of it greatly enraged Sixtus IV, who was then seriously ill. We are told that on hearing of it, he became speechless with fury, and it has been said, owing to this cause, on the following day, to the relief of all of Italy, he died. He was succeeded by Innocent VIII, Giambattista Cibo, and this caused a great improvement in Lorenzo's position. For whereas Sixtus IV had been the bitter enemy of the Medici, with Innocent VIII it was exactly the reverse. He was much impressed with the political influence of Lorenzo, and considered it very desirable to keep on good terms with the powerful ruler of Tuscany, a policy which he steadily maintained throughout his 8 years' pontificate. In 1481, the united power of the states historical of Italy, with the kings of Aragon, of Portugal, and of Hungary, was put forth to retake Otranto from the Turks, and upon the receipt of news, while the siege was proceeding, of the death of Muhammad II, Otranto capitulated. In Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella began in 1481 to drive out the Moors from the southern half of the country, a war which was to last for the next 11 years. In England, in 1488, Edward IV died. The boy, Edward V, was murdered by his uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and the latter became king. 2 years later, Richard III was himself killed at the Battle of Bosworth, and Henry VII gained the throne, putting an end to the long period of civil war which England had endured for 30 years. In France, Louis XIV also died in 1488 and was succeeded by his son, Charles VIII. The latter was a boy of 13, of weak health and small capacity. Louis XI, however, when dying, entrusted to his eldest daughter, Anne of Beaujeu, married to the Duke of Bourbon, the guardianship of her young brother and the rule of the kingdom during his minority. And for the next 9 years, she governed in his name. She displayed a high intelligence and many remarkable qualities, her nobility of character, justice, and prudence gradually overcoming the ill will of her brother, the opposition of the French nobles, and the schemes of Maximilian of Austria, obtaining for her the name of Madame la Grande. Under her wise methods of government, the prosperity of France greatly increased, while it was she who enabled Henry VII to gain the throne of England. From the year 1480, Lorenzo the Magnificent remained for the rest of his life undisturbed by dissensions in Florence, and was able to devote himself, especially after the general peace in Italy brought about in 1484, to those arts of peace which were so much more congenial to him than war. Not that his beloved studies were neglected even in the midst of war or the most pressing anxieties. In a letter to Ficino, he says, "When my mind is disturbed with the tumults of public business and my ears are stunned with the clamors of turbulent citizens, how would it be possible for me to support such contentions unless I found a relaxation in learning?" Ammirato says, "Being now completely free from foreign disturbances and having perfect quiet at home, he devoted himself to the pleasures and elegancies of peace, occupying himself in the patronage of literature, in book collecting, in beautifying the city, and bringing into cultivation the surrounding country, and in all those pursuits and studies which have made that age remarkable." And notwithstanding all the accusations of despotism made against Lorenzo, it is impossible not to notice that at no other time in Florence's history was she not only so respected abroad, but also so peaceful, prosperous, and contented at home, which clearly shows that the form of government established by him was that which ensured the maximum of happiness to the greatest number. It has also been remarked that the civil equality to which we are accustomed in modern states, but which was quite unknown to the Europe of that age, was by no means unknown to Tuscany in the time of Lorenzo the Magnificent, which seems sufficiently to show that any despotism on his part could scarcely have been of very stringent character. Nor did political affairs, literature, and art absorb the whole of Lorenzo's attention, for under his rule all industries, commerce, and public works made enormous progress. And in after times the Florentines always looked back to the time of Lorenzo the Magnificent as the happiest and most prosperous period of their history. Nor was this confined only to Florence. Guicciardini commences his celebrated history with the remark that the time of Lorenzo was a season prosperous beyond any other which Italy had experienced during the long course of 1,000 years. And after a long panegyric on its then happy state, says that this was by general consent ascribed to the industry and virtue of Lorenzo de Medici. At the same time, in the wider field of European politics, Lorenzo became recognized by all sovereigns as the leading man in Italy, and in the Florentines' archives may be seen letters to him from Henry VII of England and Louis XI of France, in which both of them address him as an equal and in the style of a reigning monarch. But the task of maintaining the peace of Italy, which had devolved upon Lorenzo, was one which taxed all his powers, and it is hard to understand how he found time, as he did, for all those pursuits which Ammirato mentions. Naples, the Pope, and Milan were only kept from war with the greatest difficulty. Nor was this all. Among the smaller states there existed a chronic condition of feud which required incessant watchfulness on Lorenzo's part in order, by skillful intervention, to prevent it from developing into actual war. He watched over the smallest matters in the politics of other states which might affect, however remotely, the welfare of Florence. Conflicting interests, mutual distrust, and veiled animosity made Italian politics of that time a perfect labyrinth of intrigue. And nowhere is the consummate statesmanship of Lorenzo more apparent than in those portions of his correspondence showing the masterly manner in which he dealt with the complex situations called forth by these conditions, and demonstrating the successful results which he achieved. But all this was not done without a strain upon his powers of mind and body, which told severely upon him, so that we can well understand the wish that he expressed that he could bury himself for 6 months in some place where no rumor of Italian affairs could reach his ears. In 1484, Florence was drawn into a desultory war with Genoa and took Pietrasanta, and in 1487, Lorenzo himself conducted an expedition against Sarzana, which had been captured from Florence during the War of 1478 to 1480, and retook that town, an act which still further increased his popularity, as the loss of Sarzana had been deeply felt by the Florentines. In August 1487, while Lorenzo was absent at the baths of Filetta, whither he had gone owing to his increasing attacks of gout, his wife, Clarice, died at 34. She died somewhat suddenly, and he heard of her death before he knew she was ill. In 1488, Pope Innocent VIII, impressed with Lorenzo's growing importance, desired a marriage between one of his sons, Francesco Cibo, and one of Lorenzo's daughters, a significant sign of the extent to which this citizen family were rising in worldly estimation. Lorenzo gave him his eldest daughter, Maddalena. They were married on the 20th of January, 1488. An episode in connection with this marriage gives us a glimpse of the simplicity of the domestic life in the Medici palace. It is related that when Francesco Cibo came with a very grand retinue from Rome for this marriage, he and his suite were splendidly lodged and luxuriously entertained in a separate palace. But after 3 days, Cibo himself went to stay at the Medici palace with his future father-in-law. There, astonished at the simple style of living, so different from what he had been accustomed to in the papal palace at Rome, as well as from that which his own retinue were receiving elsewhere, he thought that an insult was being put upon him. It was then explained to him that it was no insult, but the very reverse, that the luxurious entertainment was kept for those who were guests, but that now he was admitted, no longer as a guest, but as one of the family. In the same year, Lorenzo married, on the 22nd of May, 1488, his eldest son, Pietro, then 17, to Alfonsina Orsini, another of the same proud Roman family from whom his own wife had come. Judging from their after results, as represented in Clarice Orsini's son Pietro and Alfonsina Orsini's son Lorenzo, these two Roman marriages were not at all advantageous to the Medici family. In 1489, Lorenzo attained a desire which he had much at heart. Though only 40, his health was already failing from hereditary gout. His eldest son, Pietro, showed signs of a careless and arrogant disposition, which did not promise well for his success as a ruler of Florence. Lorenzo was therefore anxious to create a second prop to the family fortunes, so that if Pietro should fail, Giovanni, his second son, might be able to retrieve the failure. If he could get the latter made a cardinal, the family wealth and influence would probably eventually carry him to the papal throne, when the family fortunes would be assured. It was therefore a great satisfaction to Lorenzo when, by his influence with Innocent VIII, he, in this year, though Giovanni was only 13, succeeded in getting the latter created a cardinal, the youngest there had ever been. In 1490, there began in Florence the preaching of the man who was in a few years to become the chief power among Florentines. Savonarola, a native of Ferrara, had taken up as a special mission the task of recalling the inhabitants of the cities of Italy from their luxurious and profligate ways. He had preached this message first at Florence, as the most important city at that time in Italy. But unable to get the Florentines to listen to his exhortations, he had departed for several years to preach the same message at Brescia, Reggio, Genoa, and other places. And it was Lorenzo who in this year, 1490, recalled him to preach again his message of reform in Florence. And this fact should be borne in mind as counterbalancing the baseless statements so often made as to Lorenzo having led the Florentines into profligacy. Nor, even when Savonarola's preaching was aimed against himself, did Lorenzo resent it. Preaching against the prevailing licentiousness of the times, Savonarola, in predicting the downfall of the various states of Italy before a foreign conqueror, unless a general reformation of morals took place, included among the dynasties who were thus to fall not only the King of Naples, the Sforza of Milan, the Este of Ferrara, and the occupant of the papal throne, but also the Medici at Florence. Yet Lorenzo showed no resentment and took no steps to stop his preaching, though his paramount influence with Pope Innocent VIII would have enabled him at any moment to procure Savonarola's removal. In the following year, Lorenzo gave a further example of worthy command over himself. In that year, Savonarola was elected prior of the monastery of San Marco, the monastery which had been entirely built and endowed by the Medici. It was consequently customary for the prior on being elected to pay a complimentary visit to the head of the Medici family. Yet when Savonarola, deeming this a worldly and unseemly custom, declined to observe it, Lorenzo treated this discourtesy with dignified forbearance, only saying with a smile, "See now, here is a stranger who has come into my house, and will not deign even to visit me." Nevertheless, he showed good will to the prior, often attended his services, and gave as liberally as heretofore to San Marco. During these 2 years, 1490 and 1491, Lorenzo was greatly harassed by the quarrel between the King of Naples and the Pope, and by the strenuous labor it involved on his part to keep them from coming to an open rupture. King Ferrante persistently evaded compliance with the terms of the treaty which he had made with the Pope in 1486, and Lorenzo had to exert all his powers of persuasion with Innocent VIII to prevent him from endeavoring to enforce it. At length, however, in February 1492, Lorenzo's efforts to bring them to a better understanding were successful, and they agreed to a mutual settlement of their differences, which set this matter at last at rest. This completed Lorenzo's work for the maintenance of peace in Italy. He had in 22 years perfected that which his grandfather had begun, and created between Venice, Milan, the Pope, and Naples a firm balance of power which, so long as his influence watched over it, would keep Italy at peace. But Lorenzo had done more than this, and to protect Florence from the miseries of war, had created a more permanent safeguard, one undreamt of by Cosimo. Instead of the chronic enmity with her neighbors, which had hitherto always been Florence's condition, Lorenzo, a master in conciliatory action, had in the course of 22 years gradually established friendly relations with Siena, Lucca, Bologna, Faenza, Ferrara, Rimini, Perugia, and Città di Castello, thus encircling Florence with a ring of friendly states and a more lasting guarantee for her peace than even a general balance of power. These achievements had brought Italy to the condition referred to by Guicciardini as the most prosperous experienced for 1,000 years, and had made Lorenzo recognized even beyond the Alps as the leading statesman of his age. But Lorenzo the Magnificent has a greater claim to fame than any which is derived from his achievements in the political sphere. It is in the domain of learning and art that his chief honor will ever rest, and the former especially was the main interest of his life. However, much controversy may rage around the deeds of the Medici. There is one cause in regard to which it will be difficult to deny that they have deserved unstinted honor and gratitude from Europe at large, that of the resuscitation of learning, and in particular for their rescue, at great cost to themselves, of a mass of invaluable literary treasures belonging to the classic age, just in time before the spread of Turkish misrule over all the eastern countries of Europe after the fall of Constantinople had time to work its natural effects. For a very few decades of Turkish dominion over these countries would have caused all those treasures to disappear forever. Carried out by 4 generations, there were in this matter 2 stages. The time of Lorenzo, notwithstanding all the enthusiasm of the brilliant coterie he gathered around him, can scarcely be called a time of learning, such as that which followed in the time of Leo X, Erasmus, and Scaliger's. It was too early for that result. In the case of the first three of the four generations, the resuscitation of learning has reference to the splendid work done in unearthing and making known the materials by which alone later generations were enabled to become times of learning. Cosimo, Piero, and Lorenzo did this portion of the work. It remained for Lorenzo's son, Leo X, to conduct his age to the further step of becoming a time of learning through the labors of those who had gone before. The assistance which Lorenzo gave to this work was unbounded. Large as had been the amounts which his father and grandfather had given to this subject, that which Lorenzo gave was still larger. It has been computed that in the 35 years, from the recall of Cosimo in 1434 to the death of Piero in 1469, the family, over and above what they spent in the search for and rescue of manuscripts from the East, had given from their private fortune for the public benefit in the shape of institutions to assist learning in similar objects a sum equal, in our present money, to nearly £3 million sterling. To this, Lorenzo's own expenditure on the same object has to be added, and some idea of its extent may be formed from the amount which he gave annually for books alone. Mr. Walter Scaife says, allowing for the difference in the value of money, Lorenzo's annual expenditures for books alone amounted to from £65,000 to £75,000 sterling. He sent the celebrated Giovanni Lascaris twice to the Orient for the express purpose of discovering and purchasing ancient manuscripts. On his second voyage, Lascaris brought back 200 Greek works, as many as 80 of which were not up to that time even known. But this was only one item in the process. Not only had such manuscript books to be searched for in Eastern countries, but to be of any use in the spread of learning, copies of them had to be multiplied, and so an army of copyists were maintained by Lorenzo for this purpose, and kept constantly at work. And then again, there were colleges and other similar institutions to be founded for the assistance of those who had the scholar's instinct, but could not afford the necessary books or the expense of their own maintenance while studying. Among other institutions of this kind, Lorenzo founded the University of Pisa, which by his liberality to it, he made the most celebrated university of that time in Europe, except that at Florence. When he was only 23, during the time when he and Giuliano were chiefly renowned for their splendid pageants and festivities, he went, at the latter end of 1472, to Pisa to found this university, and stayed there a long time employed on this work, himself taking the direction of the new university. The state gave an annual grant to it of 6,000 florins, but as this was altogether inadequate, Lorenzo gave, to supplement it, more than double that amount out of his private fortune, and by this means obtained for its professors some of the most eminent scholars of the age. But his work at Florence in this direction was still greater. It was at Florence, and in the cause of the Greek language and literature, that the labors of Lorenzo on behalf of learning culminated. Roscoe tells us that, while the University of Pisa was for the study of the Latin language and those branches of science of which it was the principal vehicle, it was at Florence only, in all of Italy, that the Greek language was taught, and that there was established a public academy for Greek, by means of which the knowledge of the Greek tongue was extended, not only through all the rest of Italy, but through France, Spain, Germany, and England, from all which countries numerous students attended at Florence, who diffused the learning they had acquired there throughout Europe. To this Greek academy at Florence, Lorenzo gave lavishly, and for its welfare labored persistently, establishing as its professors such celebrated men as the eminent Johannes Agoropoulos, Theodorus Gaza, Demetrius Chalcondylas, and others. The celebrated William Grocyn, afterwards professor of Greek at Oxford, and Thomas Lunacer, the first English scholars who learnt Greek, acquired it at Florence under these great teachers. All this gives us some idea of how great was the cost of such work as the resuscitation of learning. And when joined to Lorenzo's large expenditure on the encouragement of art and on state expenses other than those for which he was reimbursed, it caused even the Medici wealth to be heavily reduced, so that Lorenzo the Magnificent died a very much poorer man than his father. But it was money well spent, in his own speech on becoming head of the family, made in reference to the large amount which his father and grandfather had drawn out of the family funds to spend on works of public utility, may be made applicable to himself. Some would perhaps think it would be more desirable to have a part of it in their purse, but I conceive it to have been spent to the great advantage of the public, and I am therefore perfectly satisfied. And to the very last, Lorenzo's ardor in this cause of spreading a knowledge of learning remained unabated. The ruling passion, strong in death, gained another example in his case. As the two closest of his friends, Angelo Poliziano and Pico della Mirandola, stood weeping by his bedside as he breathed his last, his dying words were, "I wish that death had spared me till I had completed your libraries." But Lorenzo's assistance to the cause of learning did not end here, or with help which he shared with his father and grandfather. The honor which literary men gave to him was not merely that given to a great patron whose wealth was ever at the service of learning, but was in even greater degree the honor paid to one who was himself an author of literary work, a leader in their own sphere. It is only in recent years that it has become appreciated how high is the place taken by Lorenzo in this respect. Modern opinion, however, credits him with having more of the poetic spirit than any other man of his time, and with having been the leading poetic influence of his age. Thus, the most recent authority on the subject says, his, Lorenzo's, sonnets and odes, canzoni, are of the finer quality than any similar verse since the death of Petrarch, and one seems to catch in them at times an echo of the less highly finished, but also less self-conscious work of the pre-Petrarchian age, the dolce stil nuovo of the expiring 13th century. Both he and his friend Polizian had felt something of the invigorating influence of the racy Florentine folk songs, and if Lorenzo had lived free from the entanglements of politics and statecraft, the course of the Cinquecento poetry might have taken another turn. Unfortunately, the fashion was left to be set by the courtly poets, by whom it was led downwards to the depths of the Seicentismo, with its conceits, its false taste, its insincere sentiment, and general lack of all masculine quality. All of Lorenzo's efforts as a writer were employed to put an end to the depreciation of the Italian tongue as compared with Latin. As a boy of 17, he had declared his belief that this was practicable. In a remarkable letter written by him in 1466 to his friend Federigo of Naples, he defended what was then the vulgar tongue, declaring that the Tuscan language possessed all the necessary qualifications for literary use, and proving his point by examples from Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio. And he urged that the language of Tuscany, so graceful in its youth, might be made to attain still greater perfection in its maturity if only the Florentines would earnestly strive to this end. All his writings were intended to assist this object, and it is chiefly due to these efforts of his that the Italian language occupies the position it now does, instead of the lower plane on which it stood in his day. Lorenzo's poetical writing covered a wide range. He was a devoted lover of nature and of country life, and all of his best works deal in some form or another with such topics. He wrote the well-known poem of the Ambra, a mythological poem on the building of his much-loved villa at Poggio a Caiano, the poem being named after a little island in the adjacent stream of the Ombrone, and being a description of the joys of the country life and of the delightful springtime in Tuscany. The Caccia col Falcone, the doings of a hawking party, La Nencia da Barbarino, on Tuscan peasant life, which Simon styles a masterpiece of true genius and humor. Bayome, a burlesque, and many other poems, also numerous sonnets and love songs, poems of his youth, mostly inspired by his romantic but unimpassioned love for Lucrezia Donati. Nothing came amiss to his muse. He could write with equal ease pastorals and devotional poetry, sonnets and carnival ditties, hunting songs and poems on stars and flowers, and all showing true poetical feeling. Lorenzo's writings, occupied so largely with that country life of which he was so fond, open up the pleasantest side of his character, While here, all events, we have the satisfaction of being on ground where controversy cannot enter, since whatever a man's writings show of himself is definite and incontrovertible. Speaking of how Lorenzo's love of nature and sympathy with the feelings and life of the country people show themselves in his poetry, Mr. Armstrong says as follows. As examples of this may be taken the stages in the rosebud's life from his poem Corinto, or a wider theme, the annual migration of the flocks to the upland pastures. The flocks pass bleating up the mountain paths, the young lambs trotting in their mother's steps. The one, just newly born, is carried in the shepherd's arms, while his fellow bears a lame sheep upon his shoulders. A third peasant is riding the mare with foal, carrying the posts and nets to guard the flocks from wolves. The dog runs to and fro, proud of his post as escort to the party. Then comes a little touch of nature unidealized. The flock is shut within the nets, the shepherds fall to their meal of milk, rolls, and biscuits, and then fall fearlessly asleep and snore all night. Equally well can the poet describe a winter scene, the crackling of the leaves beneath the hunter's feet, his quarry vainly seeking to hide its tracks, the fir tree standing green against the white mountains, or bending its branches beneath its load of snow, the laurel standing young and joyous amid the dry, leafless trees, the solitary bird that still finds a hiding place in the stout cypress which is doing battle with the winds, the olive grove on a balmy sunny shore, whose leaves show green or silver according to the setting of the wind. Lorenzo finds his materials in the troubles of life as in its joys. He enters keenly into the sufferings of the peasant and of animals. He describes one of the woodland fires common in mountain districts, a chance spark of the flint catching the dry leaves and then spreading to the brushwood, and then gaining on ancient oak and ilex, destroying the shadowy forest homes, the pleasant nests, the lairs where generations of wild things have stalled themselves, and then the wild rout of terror-stricken creatures bellowing and shrieking down the echoing dale. At another time, we see the Ombrone in flood, and its turbid yellow waters grinding stone on stone, bearing along the plain its mountain spoil of trunk and bough. The peasant's wife is just in time to free, with trembling hand, the cattle from the stall. She carries pickaback, her weeping little son. Behind her is her elder daughter with the poor household store. The old shed floats bobbing on the water's crest. It is the close observance of nature which makes Lorenzo's poetry ever fresh, whether he is describing ants or bees, or a line of cranes stretching across the sky towards a sunny spot, or the hunted deer taking its last desperate leap in the straining eyes of the baffled dogs, or the oxen struggling with their load of stone and logs, or the tired bird falling into the sea because it fears to light upon a ship. Everyone who is conversant with a sportsman's life will feel how these writings of Lorenzo call up scene after scene which has come before his own eyes in the wild life of the mountains, how he is brought in sympathy with the writer, and how none but a man who was an ardent lover of nature, of animals, and of the country people could observe and write like this. But no picture of Lorenzo the Magnificent would be complete without notice of that brilliant inner circle of literary men who were his closest friends. Among these the chief were Politian, who before he was 18 was already renowned for his translation of the Iliad into Latin. At 26 was lecturing to students from all countries in Europe on the Greek and Latin classics, and who, though he died at 39, was the greatest poet of his time. Maxilio Ficino, who, born in 1433 and trained by Cosimo Pater Patria, translated Plato and many other works of the ancient writers into Latin, and became head of the Platonic Academy. Luigi Pulci, whose celebrated epic poem Il Morgante Maggiore is said to have been written at the request of Lucrezia Tornabuoni, Lorenzo's mother, and Pico, Count of Mirandola, the most brilliant of the whole band, and celebrated throughout Europe, young, handsome, clever, lofty in character, with graceful bearing and golden hair. knowing 22 languages, including Latin, Hebrew, Arabic, and Chaldee, and whose many attainments were the marvel of mankind. He was the most distinguished literary man of the age. Politian calls him the phoenix who rested in the laurel, Lorenzo. To him, we are told, all knowledge and all religions were a revelation of God. Savonarola revered his memory, and in his Triumphus Cruris, written after Pico's death, declares that by reason of his loftiness of intellect and the sublimity of his doctrine, he should be numbered among the miracles of God and nature. Sir Thomas More translated his letters and held him to be a saint. Lorenzo's two closest friends, Politian and Pico della Mirandola, both died soon after him. Politian at the age of 39, Pico at that of 31, both of them dying in 1494. To the above four must also be added the celebrated scholar Cristoforo Landino, who in his Disputations, first published about 1475, relates certain notable discussions of this group of brilliant intellects which took place when, on one occasion, they were gathered at Camaldoli. And Vespasiano da Bisticci, the last of the master copyists and the first of modern booksellers, the largest employer of professional copyists in Europe, whose book, The Lives of Illustrious Men, is a mine of information regarding many important historical characters of the time, written by one who knew them personally. Such were some of the men who were the chief lights in that distinguished society which Lorenzo the Magnificent created around him. A literary coterie, probably the most brilliant in intellect which has ever been gathered together at one time and place. A coterie whose mission was the spread of a new culture, and the effect of whose achievements was destined to be widely felt before another century was over. When we turn to the subject of art, we find Lorenzo's encouragement no less great, except in the difference created by the fact that he was not himself an artist. He more than doubled the art collections of the Medici Palace, and there was scarcely a contemporary painter or sculptor who was not assisted by him, while to his liberal patronage he added a universally valued critical knowledge. The unerring taste in art which the Medici as a family possessed is evidenced by the fact that no painter or sculptor of that age is to be found whose work is recognized now as of high excellence, yet who was not appreciated by the Medici. They never made a mistake in such matters. To this unerring taste on their part, Florence owes it that while the art collections of Rome, accumulated by the popes, are greater in quantity, those of Florence, almost entirely the private collections of the Medici, surpass those of Rome in quality. And no member of his family possessed this sound critical knowledge and infallible taste to so great a degree as Lorenzo the Magnificent. As had been the case with his father Piero, the leading artists of the day did most of their work for him, and nearly every work of eminence in painting or sculpture belonging to Lorenzo's time, remaining in Florence, was commissioned by him. Verrocchio did almost all his work for him. That sculptor's graceful tomb in San Lorenzo over Lorenzo's father and uncle, his bronze David, and his fountain of the boy with a dolphin were all executed for Lorenzo. Botticelli he made his family painter as well as friend, and all the pictures of Botticelli's second period were painted for him. It was Lorenzo who caused Ghirlandaio's frescoes in Santa Maria Novella and Santa Trinita to be painted, and it was he who selected and sent Leonardo da Vinci to Milan to become Il Moro's great painter. Among others, he also gave commissions to Filippino Lippi, Signorelli, Baldovinetti, Benedetto da Majano, Andrea da Castagno, and Pollagiulio. The Medici Palace became, Simon says, a museum at that period unique in Europe, considering the number and value of its art treasures, and these he made available to all young artists for purposes of study. There being at that time no school for sculpture, Lorenzo formed one in his garden near San Marco, collected their casts from many antique statues, placed the school in charge of Donatello's pupil, Bertoldo, and invited all young sculptors to study there. Among those who did were Lorenzo di Credi, Michelangelo, and many others afterwards famous. Vasari says that every young man who studied in this garden distinguished himself. Lorenzo had an eagle eye for detecting genius, and when Michelangelo was 15 years old, Lorenzo, chancing to see in his garden the mask of a grinning faun which the boy had sculptured, made him an inmate of the Medici palace, where he was treated as one of the family, and Vasari says was given an allowance of 5 ducats a month, and resided there for 4 years, which, if the case, would mean until the Medici family were driven into exile in 1494. And it was an important time for such encouragement to art, for the Renaissance in art was now approaching the full blaze of its zenith. Every one of the great masters, except Tintoretto, was living in the time of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and although these, Luini, Fra Bartolomeo, Michelangelo, Giorgione, Titian, Palma Vecchio, Sodoma, Andrea del Sarto, and Raphael were as yet children, the following were all at work: Verrocchio, Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, Perugino, Leonardo da Vinci, Filippino Lippi, and Lorenzo di Credi. Besides the Bellini and Carpaccio at Venice, Mantegna and Mantua, Francia at Bologna, and Pinturicchio at Perugia. Verrocchio, the true eye, whose real name was Andrea di Cione, was the chief pupil of Donatello. He executed many works for Lorenzo the Magnificent, but whether owing to the subsequent commotions when the Medici were driven out and their palace plundered, or other cause, very few of his works remain. Among these are his tomb of Giovanni and Piero de' Medici in San Lorenzo, his bronze statue of David, now in the Bargello Museum, the group of Christ and St. Thomas outside, or San Michele, which has been said to be the most beautiful head of Christ ever executed, and his fountain, the boy with a dolphin, made for Lorenzo's villa at Careggi, and now in the courtyard of the Palazzo Vecchio. One writer calls this statue the little boy who forever flits across the court, while the dolphin struggles in his arms, whose pressure sends the water spurting from its nostrils. And Perkins says, like a sunbeam which has found its way into these gloomy precincts, it brightens them by its presence. Verrocchio's last work was the splendid equestrian statue in bronze of Colleone in Venice, the second equestrian statue executed since the times of ancient Rome, and superior to that of Gattamelata by Donatello at Padua. Verrocchio only lived to complete the model in clay of both the horse and man, and the casting was completed by Leopardi. Still, less of Verrocchio's work as a painter remains. Besides the baptism of Christ, now in the Accademia, only one other of his pictures is in existence, that of the Madonna adoring the infant child, attained by Ruskin in 1878 from the Manfredi Palace in Venice, where it had been apparently overlooked, and now in the Ruskin Museum at Sheffield. But Verrocchio's chief fame as a painter is that he was the master of Lorenzo di Credi and Leonardo da Vinci. Verrocchio died in 1488. When to the graver atmosphere of the time of Piero il Gottoso there succeeded all the season of youthful joy and lightheartedness which marked the first 9 years of the rule of Lorenzo the Magnificent. This change in the spirit of the time caused a corresponding change in Botticelli's painting, so that we find him painting in his second period all those pictures which are so permeated with the spirit of that time. To these have been added, in the latter half of this period of his painting, his fresco pictures at Rome. The chief pictures of Botticelli's second period are the Birth of Venus, Mars and Venus, the Return of Spring, and Pallas, subduing the Centaur, pictures in which contemporary events are memorialized under the symbolism of classic myths clothed in a 15th century dress. We've already seen how the first three of these refer to the tournament of 1475, to the brighter era which Lorenzo had inaugurated, and to his work in the domain of literature, and how the fourth refers to the deliverance of Florence by Lorenzo from war and peril following the Pazzi conspiracy. Soon after the war was ended, Botticelli was summoned in 1481 by Pope Sixtus to Rome to assist, with Perugino and Ghirlandaio, in painting the celebrated series of frescoes covering the walls of the newly erected Sistine Chapel. His portions of this work consist of the frescoes representing the early life of Moses, the destruction of Korah, the purification of the leper, the temptation of Christ, and the portraits of the 7 martyred bishops of Rome. These important frescoes gained Botticelli added renown, and he returned to Florence with a great reputation. For the next few years, he was, in consequence, in great request among the owners of important villas near Florence, all desiring to have frescoes painted by him in their villas. Amongst others, he painted at this time for Lorenzo Tornabuoni an important series of frescoes in the villa of the Tornabuoni family, now Villa Lemmi at Rifredi, representing events in the history of the family. Also, a series of frescoes in the Villa of Castello, painted for Giovanni di Pier Francesco of the younger branch of the Medici family. Then came the death of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and the expulsion shortly afterwards of the Medici, and Botticelli found himself in a Florence, the whole atmosphere of which was completely changed under the influence of Savonarola. So again, Botticelli's style changes, and we have the pictures of his third period, which will best be considered in connection with the events which caused the entire change in the life of Florence. As in Cosimo's day, so also was it in that of Lorenzo. There could scarcely be a greater contrast than exists between the two chief painters of his time, Botticelli and Ghirlandaio. The former so full of that spirit of speaking to the mind through the eye that every one of his pictures is replete with deep and original thoughts, the latter absolutely without a vestige of this power. Ghirlandaio, though his drawing and coloring are perfect, is constantly called commonplace and prosaic, while it has even been said of him, notwithstanding all his powers of technique, that he is without the art faculty. And this feeling regarding his work is undoubtedly caused by this entire absence in him of imagination and originality of thought. Thus, in his pictures, we find our attention ever drawn to the accessories of the subject, rather than to the subject itself. While all such accessories, he is a most careful and prosaically accurate delineator. But each of the great masters has his own excellence, and Ghirlandaio's lies in this very direction. Ruskin, being noticeably without the historic faculty, could see no excellence in Ghirlandaio, and severely condemns his work on all occasions, calling it the mere handicraft of the mechanic. But those who are interested in what the men and women of this time in Florence looked like can forgive Ghirlandaio his want of the art faculty for the sake of the results on the historic side. Results which, had he not given them to us, we should have looked for in vain elsewhere. Ghirlandaio's want of originality led him to be a most careful copyist in every direction to which he turned his powers, and, as he introduced into his pictures on religious subjects representations of the persons of note around him, carried out with a careful accuracy which rendered him quite incapable of flattering them, together with many details of everyday life in Florence, we obtain from him a valuable record of the appearance and manner of life of men and women of the time of Lorenzo the Magnificent. In this way, Ghirlandaio gives us, in his frescoes in the choir of Santa Maria Novella, portraits of Politian, Marsilio Ficini, Cristoforo Landino, and Demetrius. Chalcondylas, of the painters Baldo Vinetti, Maina Ardi, Ghirlandaio himself, and his brother, of the bankers Sassetti and Ridolfi, and the members of the Tornabuoni family, of the reigning Florentine beauty of the day, Giovanna degli Albizzi, who in 1486 married Lorenzo Tornabuoni, of the well-known dealer in arms and armor, Niccolo Caparra, and others. Again, in his frescoes in the church of Santa Trinita, we have portraits of Maso degli Albizzi, Palestrozzi, Agnolo Acciajuoli, and of Lorenzo himself. And in the church of Ognissanti, in his fresco of the Vespucci family, he has given us a portrait painted about 1474 of Amerigo Vespucci, who gave his name to America. Ghirlandaio's best picture is The Adoration of the Shepherds, painted for the Sassetti Chapel in Santa Trinita, and now in the Accademia delle Belle Arti. Ghirlandaio died in 1494 and is buried in Santa Maria Novella. In Lorenzo's time, the four principal villas possessed by the Medici, were the Villa Careggi, the Medici Villa at Fiesole, the Villa Cafaggiolo in the valley of the Mugello, originally built by Cosimo and largely added to by Lorenzo, and the Villa at Poggio a Caiano, about 12 miles to the northwest of Florence, built by Lorenzo. Lorenzo only lived for 2 months after effecting the reconciliation between the King of Naples and the Pope. He had for years suffered, like his father and his grandfather, from gout, and all through the year of 1491 his health was rapidly failing. In consequence, he had begun to entrust part of the public affairs to his eldest son, Pietro. In giving the latter advice regarding his future conduct as head of the state, Lorenzo specially warned him never to forget that his position was simply that of a citizen of Florence, telling him that his own success had been mainly due to his uniform care on this point. In February 1492, Lorenzo's attacks became so severe that he was unable to attend to any business. Early in March, the 3 years expired during which his son Giovanni's appointment as a cardinal was to be kept secret, and it was publicly announced. He was formally invested with his new rank at the Badia of Fiesole, and a grand banquet was given at the Medici Palace in honor of the occasion. But Lorenzo was only able to be carried in on a litter to see the brilliant company assembled to do honor to his son. Giovanni, now 16, had forthwith to leave for Rome to take his seat in the Sacred College, and on the 12th of March he left Florence for the papal city. 9 days later, Lorenzo had himself carried to Careggi and prepared for his end, gathering around him several of his closest friends and making them read to him portions of his favorite authors. From his deathbed, he wrote to Giovanni a long letter of advice and farewell. This letter to his son is a very remarkable one, striking as it is for its evidence of calm equanimity and mental vigor unimpaired even by severe illness and approaching death. It is yet more so for the light it throws on Lorenzo's character, for to a large extent it contradicts forcibly the view of him which a long succession of writers resolutely biased against him and have made the prevailing one. Not remarkable, perhaps, had it emanated from some other source. It is so to us solely because of the false impression of the man which has been given to us. Lorenzo died on the 9th of April, 1492, at the age of 43, at his villa of Careggi, that much-loved home of his leisure hours, where Plato and Homer, Virgil and Horace had been worshipped and the Muses revered. His 2 closest friends, Politian and Pico della Mirandola, were with him to the last. As his end approached, he sent for a priest, who administered to him the last sacrament. He got out of bed to receive it, kneeling, but was too weak and had to lie down again. He had already sent to ask Savonarola to come to him, and it says much for Lorenzo that he should have desired an interview with the uncompromising friar. After it was over, a crucifix was held before Lorenzo. He raised himself up to kiss it, fell back, and died. There are 2 very different accounts of what took place at the interview with Savonarola. On one hand, we have the account written at the time by Politian, who was present and who simply states that Savonarola exhorted Lorenzo to hold fast to the faith, to resolve to amend his life if spared, and to meet death, if it was so to be, with fortitude, and that he prayed with him and gave him his blessing. The other account, which appeared long afterwards, is the well-known story that Lorenzo confessed to Savonarola 3 sins, which lay heavy on his conscience: the sack of Volterra, the bloodshed after the Pazzi conspiracy, and the misappropriation to his own use of some of the dower fund, that Savonarola required from him a promise to restore the money thus misappropriated, to which it is said Lorenzo assented. That Savonarola then required that he should restore the liberties of Florence, to which Lorenzo made no reply, and that thereupon Savonarola left him unabsolved. This picturesque story bears on its face evidence of its falsity. It did not appear until 50 years after Lorenzo and Savonarola were both dead, and admittedly rests on hearsay evidence, whereas Politian wrote as an eyewitness, and within a few weeks of the event. Supposing this story true, then it must have been related either by Lorenzo or by Savonarola, for it expressly states that none other was present when Lorenzo made his confession. Berlamacci, who put it forward, declared that he had the story from Savonarola's own lips. But, says Bishop Creighton, we may be pardoned for sparing Savonarola's fame the supposition that he made political capital for his own glorification out of the secrets of the confessional. Still less probable is it that the tale was revealed by Lorenzo in an agony of remorse after Savonarola's departure and just before his death. Moreover, a still more conclusive fact has failed to be observed, namely, that no matter what may or may not be the truth about them, the 3 things represented as weighing on Lorenzo's conscience could not have done so from Lorenzo's point of view. For the sack of Volterra he was so remotely responsible, and had made such efforts to ameliorate the sufferings caused, that he could not have felt the matter weighing on his conscience. For the slaughter in connection with the Pazzi conspiracy, he was not only not responsible, but had remonstrated with the infuriated people against it, and had saved some of those implicated in the crime. While as regards to the dower fund, the charge would, for the reasons already stated, have appeared to him merely absurd, and still more so, since Lorenzo's just dealing in all money matters is very noticeable. Not only just, but liberal dealing in money matters was a marked feature of his character. The so-called misappropriation has been explained above, but in this connection it may be remarked that when 4 years afterwards Savonarola was himself the ruling power in Florence, exactly the same use or misappropriation of the money of this dower fund was continued, which completely stultifies any such charge as specially applicable to Lorenzo. Lastly, the final request attributed to Savonarola would have meant the return to a state of things which to Lorenzo represented everything most harmful to Florence's welfare. While it is inconceivable that Savonarola should have required from the dying man that which he was in any case at that moment powerless to perform, this story has probably played a greater part in creating the mental picture generally formed of Lorenzo the Magnificent than any of the authenticated facts of his life. The artifice of pretending that certain things weighed on his conscience is a much more effective way of instilling in us a belief that he had been guilty of those things than a plain statement to that effect would have been. The story has had a great vogue, both on account of its sensational character and of the opportunity it furnishes for calumniating the Medici, but since the careful analysis of it made by Bishop Creighton, its complete mendacity has been fully established. Roscoe's remark is justified. A story that exhibits evident symptoms of that party spirit which did not arise in Florence until after the death of Lorenzo, and which is entirely contradictory to the account left by Politian, written before the motives for misrepresentation existed, is rendered deserving of notice only by the necessity of its refutation. Lorenzo the Magnificent and Clarice Orsini had 7 children: Pietro, who succeeded his father; Giovanni, afterwards Pope Leo X; Giuliano, afterwards Duc de Nemours; Maddalena, who married Francesco Cibo; Lucrezia, who married Jacopo Salviati; Maria, who died unmarried in 1487; Contessina, who married Piero Ridolfi. Lucrezia's husband was a great-grandson of Jacopo Salviati, who was Cosimo's friend, and was a cousin of the Archbishop Salviati, hung in the Pazzi conspiracy. Lorenzo made the match to re-establish cordial relations between his family and their old friends, the Salviati. In appearance, Lorenzo the Magnificent was unprepossessing. At the same time, the portrait of him by Vasari, painted more than 50 years after Lorenzo's death by a man who never saw him, would seem not to give a true likeness of him. It neither accords with the descriptions of his appearance given by contemporary writers, nor with the portraits of him on medallions by contemporary medallists, and would almost seem intended to degrade his memory by giving him as sinister an appearance as possible, surrounding him with the attributes of a buffoon. Niccolo Valori, speaking of Lorenzo's appearance, says he was above the common stature, broad-shouldered and solidly built, and second to none in athletic exercises. His complexion was dark, and although his face was not handsome, it was so full of dignity as to compel respect. It is well known that medallions of this period are, as a rule, much more reliable than painted portraits, and the two which exist of Lorenzo, by the celebrated contemporary medallists, Bertoldo and Polo Giuliolo, show a plain but very powerful face, with something of the look of his father, Piero il Gottoso. The portraits on these medallions also receive strong corroboration from the terracotta cast of Lorenzo's face taken after his death, and now the property of the Società della Colombaria, so that we may conclude that these portraits, and not Vasari's picture, give us the true representation of Lorenzo. Speaking of the concentrated power of his face, Miss Crutwell says, "In the best portraits that exist of him, that of the Pazzi medal and the superb death mask of the confraternity of the Colombaria, the face, with its compressed lips, stern brow, and powerful jaw, might serve as the embodiment of physical and intellectual force. If, however, Lorenzo's outward appearance assisted him little, his manner more than restored the balance. It is said to have been so extraordinarily fascinating that it caused his plain face and harsh voice to be entirely forgotten." The statement of contemporary writers is fully borne out by various episodes in Lorenzo's life, which make it evident that he had an unfailing power of charming all, both high and low, who were brought in contact with him. Speaking of Lorenzo in his social capacity, Mr. Armstrong says, "Of his qualities as a host and companion there can be no question. He was the soul of courtesy and kindliness, always ready to aid talent, to oblige a friend, to grant a petition, to perpetrate a job, to be buttonholed in the public street." The simplicity and friendliness of his letters to his ambassadors fully account for the devotion with which they served him. For scholars and artists, he kept open house. Whoever came first, whatever his age or rank, took his seat at the host's side. His conversation, as his character, had the fascination of variety. At times his tongue had a rough edge. To a cousin who boasted of his copious supply of water at his villa, he says, "Then you might well afford to keep cleaner hands." To a Sienese who condoled with him on his indifferent eyesight and added the air of Florence was bad for the sight, Lorenzo retorts, "And that of Siena for the brain." To one who adversely criticized the character of the musician Squarcialupo, Lorenzo said, "If you knew how hard it is to obtain perfection in any art, you would overlook shortcomings." His achievements have already been detailed. But that a man who died at the age of 43 should have been able to do all that he did, in raising Florence so high in political power and commercial prosperity, in maintaining peace of Italy and converting chronic enmity with surrounding states into friendship, in making the Tuscan language the general language of Italy by his works as an author, in carrying forward to so great an extent the resuscitation of learning, and in helping so large the advancement of art, is extraordinary. It did, in very truth, require that enduring, indomitable strength, which he symbolized by his crest of the 3 diamond rings, to achieve such results in so comparatively short a life. Lorenzo the Magnificent has been acknowledged by the United Voice of Europe to have been one of the most remarkable men who ever held the rule of a state, and his character has always interested mankind, though perhaps it is only in these days that his greatness in a larger sphere has come to be fully appreciated. He was a leader in an age which abounded with great men, and he has been recognized as being one of the chief inspiring forces of the 15th century. He is the most important man of all those whose story we are following, and it is therefore worthwhile to examine that much debated character in more detail than can be devoted to others. The violently contradictory opinions common in regard to the Medici culminate in the case of Lorenzo the Magnificent. With writers belonging to the one camp, he has every virtue; with those belonging to the other, every vice. With the former, all his actions are attributed to the noblest motives. With the latter, even the most ordinary actions are, in order to show base motives, distorted until they result in statements which are glaringly incompatible. Apart, however, from this point, another difficulty lies in the versatility of his character, a quality of many-sidedness which he shared with many of his family, but which was specially prominent in him. Speaking of this characteristic in Lorenzo, and the difficulty which it creates, Armstrong says as follows: "It is the prize or the penalty of a versatile, receptive nature to be regarded as a mystery. The slower mind cannot follow with sufficient speed the workings of so sensitive an instrument, though the eye marks the multiplicity of results. The reality is that the action and reaction of circumstances and character are peculiarly rapid, but the observer believes that the outward manifestations are artificial and dramatic, having little relation to the inner life." This forms a real difficulty in the appreciation of the Southern European character by Anglo-Saxons, who are seldom genuinely versatile. They have an inborn, deep-seated distrust for such natures. The few English public men, for instance, who have been so gifted, have been regarded at the best as problems, but more often as impostors or as characters abnormally weak and changeable. Thus it is that Lorenzo the Magnificent has been so often called a mystery. Really, however, there has seldom been a nature less mysterious. He was completely natural, singularly open to the influence of circumstances. As his intellect was versatile, so his character was receptive. He possessed in abundance that quality of give and take, that power of impressing others and of receiving their impression, that gift of simpatia, which to the Italian expresses so much more than its English representative. Lorenzo was equally natural and unaffected, whether he were planning a comic novelty for the carnival or critically examining the last manuscript that his agents had brought or forwarded from Greece or elsewhere. At table, he would give grave advice to young Michelangelo, throw a rhyme or epigram across the board to Pulci, or discuss the problem of unity in plurality with Marsilio Ficino. He would give audience to an ambassador or a horse trainer or a popular preacher, hold a party caucus in the Via Larga, attend a critical meeting of the government, and then ride off to Careggi or Caiano to play with his children, arise with the lark to ride to hounds, or fly his favorite falcons. Lorenzo's versatility is the frequent theme even of his contemporary countrymen. A lover of the country rather than of the town, whenever he could, he would escape to Poggio a Caiano, or more distant villas. He was fond of the country people, their manners, their songs, and their pleasures. His family life was extremely simple. He romped with his children, joined in their music, wrote a religious play for them to act. In Lorenzo's career, it is impossible to draw a hard and fast line between diplomacy and politics, art and literature, religion and philosophy, domesticity and public life, country sports and city functions. It is difficult to analyze so manifold a character. Among the charges which, at a later age, found to make against Lorenzo that of profligacy and of corrupting the Florentines, gives most evidence of the virulent partisan spirit which has been mentioned, owing to the entire want of ground for the accusation. So far as his private character is concerned, no facts have been brought forward to support the charge. Judged by the standard of his day, He was not an immoral man. His conduct in respect was superior to that of contemporary sovereigns, our own in England not excepted. It is also noticeable that no illegitimate children are ascribed to him, almost a unique instance in that age. But it is in his public capacity that the charge is chiefly made, alleging that he debased the popular taste by the introduction of licentiousness into art and literature, an accusation utterly without foundation, and leveled against one, most of whose poetry was of an elevating character. In support of this charge, his carnival songs are often cited. But here again, the standard of the age must determine the point, and judged by that standard, the verdict will be conclusive. Nothing can be said against Lorenzo's poetry in this respect which cannot be said with much greater force against, for instance, Shakespeare. Roscoe remarks, "In the poem of Brandolini, the attention of Lorenzo to the dictates of morality is the particular subject of praise, and that by a contemporary writer. Had the conduct of Lorenzo been notoriously licentious, such praise would have been the severest satire." The accusation that the profligacy of the time among the Florentines is to be laid on Lorenzo's shoulders receives strong contradiction from the contemporary records of Milan, Venice, Ferrara, Mantua, and many other capital cities of Italy, since we find there, at this period, exactly the same state of things, and the same tendency to sensuous amusements and licentiousness replacing a severer style of life. It was a general result of the bursting forth of the Renaissance, and had no special manifestation in Florence. In fact, rather the reverse. Lorenzo, as regarded his own private life, was better than his time, while the idea that a ruler should endeavor to elevate his people was one which did not dawn on Europe till many generations later, and it is not likely that it ever crossed his mind. By other writers, again, this corruption of the Florentines is declared to consist in a deterioration from their former strength of character, and the charge which these writers make against Lorenzo is that of having exercised an enfeebling influence. But we do not find this supposed enfeeblement borne out by the history of the time, or find that the Florentines at the end of Lorenzo's rule any feebler in character than at its commencement. The Florence, which in 1494 did not quail before the threats of Charles VIII, showed itself no less strong than that which in 1478 braved the wrath of Sixtus IV. It was another kind of enfeeblement of which, after the exile of the Medici, the Florentines had to complain, that due to their own faction fighting, and not to any action on the part of Lorenzo. Another charge which shows no less animus is that which asserts that Lorenzo enriched himself at the expense of the public funds. Various circumstances afforded opportunity for this charge. Not only was Lorenzo expected to provide royal hospitality in the Medici Palace to distinguished visitors to Florence, expenditure which was seldom refunded to him by the state, but also he frequently had to advance from the Medici Bank the war expenses of the state, and this was sometimes refunded to him and sometimes not. He had also, in the conduct of foreign affairs, constantly to disburse large sums as secret subsidies to foreign states. These sums were either advanced or reimbursed to him by the state, but the secret nature of their expenditure naturally left it open to anyone to suggest that he spent the money on himself. Those to whom every act of the Medici has an evil aspect have not failed to take advantage of such an opportunity, while it seems forgotten that secret service money is a regular item of expenditure of every modern government and is necessarily never accounted for by the high official to whom its expenditure is entrusted. Hence we find these transactions called peculation and embezzlement on Lorenzo's part. Such a charge, made against one who had spent his private funds on the public behalf to so large an extent that even the immense fortune left him by his father was severely reduced thereby, gives us a measure of the length to which the partisan spirit against the Medici can go. At a meeting held 3 days after Lorenzo's funeral, the Signoria officially placed it on record that he always subordinated his own interest to the advantage and benefit of the community. shrank neither from trouble nor danger for the good of the state and its freedom, and devoted to that object all his thoughts and powers, securing public order by excellent laws. Are we then, on the one hand, to hold this as the correct view of Lorenzo's character and conduct, and that Hallam, Burckhardt, and Gregorovius are right? Or, on the other hand, was Lorenzo a usurper who aimed only at his own interest and embezzled the public money, one in whom the enslavement of Florence was the hard work of his manhood, and one who, for this end, deliberately led the Florentines into profligacy, as alleged by Sismondi, Perrin, Simmons, Villari, and Trollope. Examining the conflicting evidence, and more particularly the facts of Lorenzo's life, admitted by all, it would appear that the charge of being a usurper cannot be maintained, especially in the face of the high authority of Hallam. That the charge of having enslaved or made himself a tyrant over Florence is utterly irreconcilable with the fact that he had no military force, and that his power rested solely on the will of the people. That the charge of embezzlement is, for the reasons already given, one which only prejudice can assert. And that the charge of profligacy, of debasing the public taste by introducing licentiousness into art and letters, is without an atom of foundation. But, after all, the best evidence as to which side in this controversy is right is furnished by the people of Florence themselves, those who lived under Lorenzo's rule, and who, if his actions were such as his detractors have asserted, had to bear the results of them. Did the Florentines as a whole, during his lifetime, regard Lorenzo with pride and approbation, and sorrow for his death as a national loss? Or did they look upon that death as a joyful release to them from the tyranny of a usurper who embezzled the moneys of the state and enriched himself at their expense? It is incontestable that the former, and not the latter, was the view they held, and the evidence which such a fact supplies is absolutely conclusive upon the whole matter. Lorenzo's funeral was, in accordance with his own instructions, an unostentatious one. He was buried, like his great-grandfather and father, in the old sacristy in San Lorenzo, in the same tomb with his brother Giuliano. From thence, however, his and Giuliano's remains were, 67 years afterwards, removed to the new sacristy, which had by that time been added to the church. Lorenzo and Giuliano lie buried under the end wall of this sacristy, that opposite to the altar. It is, however, strange to record that no monument marks the grave of the great Lorenzo the Magnificent, while we see that the absence of such a monument actually in course of time caused a doubt as to where he was buried. Michelangelo was to have executed a monument for his tomb, but left Florence without doing so, and so matters have remained ever since. Probably this is chiefly because none have since liked to propose the erection of a monument which by its situation would challenge comparison with the only two other tombs in the chapel, the masterpieces of Michelangelo. No doubt the difficulty is a considerable one. At the same time, it seems, from a national point of view, a great pity that it should not work such a result. If one may venture to suggest, possibly the difficulty might be met by placing on the wall over the tomb a large black marble slab, perfectly plain, with simply the name Lorenzo il Magnifico on it, and the year of birth and death, without any other words. It would rely for impressiveness solely on its size, massiveness, and absolute plainness. Such a monument would avoid all clashing with Michelangelo's masterpieces, while it would be in accord with Lorenzo's own sentiments, shown in the instructions as to his funeral, as well as with the spirit of those earlier generations of the Medici, to which these two brothers belonged. Mr. Armstrong's words on the absence of any monument in Florence to Lorenzo the Magnificent are as follows. Florence has not repaid the generous recognition to Lorenzo which he himself gave to others. With or without her wish, the fame of the Medici will forever be linked with hers. In Lorenzo's own words, the house goes with the state. After 400 years, she might well lay the ghost, if such there be, of political antipathy to honor with a fitting monument the most national, the most gifted representative of that many-sided culture, for which the city of the Arno is still famous. Several important events in the history of Europe took place in the same year as the death of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Spain. The consolidation of Spain, begun in 1469 by the marriage of Ferdinand, King of Aragon, with Isabella, Queen of Castile, was in 1492 completed. Ferdinand and Isabella, joint sovereigns, after having between the years 1474 and 1481 created peace and order in their previously troubled dominion, resumed in the latter year the war against the Moors. Their arms met with a wonderful succession of victories, and at length, in 1492, after 11 years of war, Granada, which had been the Moorish capital for 250 years, was taken. The Mohammedan power in Spain was ended, and they were driven out after 800 years of occupation. In the same year, there also took place the discovery of America by Columbus, under the auspices of Ferdinand and Isabella, which added still further to the glory of their reign and to the power of Spain. The year 1492 was truly a great one for Spain. Rome. In the same year, 2 months after the death of Lorenzo the Magnificent, Pope Innocent VIII also died. He was succeeded by the notorious Spaniard, Rodrigo Borgia, Alexander VI. This caused Giovanni de Medici to return to Florence, he being one of the cardinals who had voted against Rodrigo Borgia's election, and all these having to fly from Rome. France. In this year, Charles VIII, having attained the age of 22, took over the government of the kingdom from his capable sister, and began to form projects which were, ere long, to issue in an invasion of Italy, destined to usher in a new era in international politics.
We hope you enjoyed this video. Please let us know in the comments what other art contents you would like to see. And don't forget to like this video and follow our channel. Thank you, and until the next video.